Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Ball and Story. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you doze off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. In this new story, the Appalachian Mountains don't let you leave. The thick canopy of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia has a way of swallowing sound long before it reaches the nearest paved road. In the late summer of 1994, a group of experienced hikers set out for a 4-day trek through a remote section of the Cranberry Wilderness, an area known for its dense thickets and unpredictable weather. They weren't looking for anything beyond a quiet escape from their suburban lives, but the environment began to shift in ways that none of them could rationally explain within the first 24 hours. It started with a collective sensation of being watched from the tree line, a feeling so pervasive that the group stopped talking entirely to listen for footsteps that never quite synchronized with their own. The air felt heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself rather than the wind in the trees. As the first evening approached, the group found a flat clearing to set up their tents, but the forest around them remained unnaturally silent. Usually, the Appalachian woods at night are a chaotic symphony of insects, owls, and small mammals moving through the underbrush, but this particular night was marked by a total absence of biological noise. One hiker reported that even the campfire didn't seem to crackle the way it should, as if the oxygen in the area was too thin or the sound was being muffled by an invisible barrier. They sat in a tight circle, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, where the shadows of the spruce trees seemed to elongate and retract independently of the flickering flames. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit they felt an overwhelming urge to pack up and run back toward the trailhead in the middle of the night. When morning broke, the orientation of their campsite appeared subtly different than it had been when they went to sleep. The lead hiker, who had navigated these trails for over a decade, noted that the sun was rising over a ridge that should have been to their west if their compass readings from the previous night were accurate. They checked their equipment only to find that 3 separate compasses were spinning lazily in circles, unable to find a magnetic north. There was no storm, no nearby power lines, and no geological reason for such a massive magnetic disturbance in that specific limestone-heavy region. They decided to head back the way they came, but the trail they had clearly carved through the brush the day before was gone, replaced by a wall of ancient, undisturbed rhododendrons that looked like they hadn't been touched in a century. The sense of spatial distortion grew more intense as they attempted to backtrack using the sun as a guide. They walked for 6 hours at a steady pace, which should have put them back at their original starting point, but they instead found themselves standing in the exact same clearing they had left that morning. Their own footprints from the night before were missing, yet their discarded fire pit and the flattened grass where their tents had been remained perfectly intact. It was as if the world outside that small circle had reset itself while they were moving. Panic began to set in among the younger members of the group, who claimed the trees were literally shifting positions when they weren't looking directly at them. The light in the forest took on a bruised, purplish hue that didn't correspond with the time of day or the clear sky visible through the breaks in the canopy. By the second night, the psychological strain was manifesting as physical symptoms. Several hikers complained of a metallic taste in their mouths and a persistent ringing in their ears that made communication difficult. They tried to keep a log of their experiences, but when they looked at the notebooks later, the writing appeared as illegible scribbles that didn't resemble their own handwriting. One witness claimed she saw a figure standing just outside the reach of their flashlight beams, describing it not as a person or an animal, but as a hole in the darkness that was darker than the night surrounding it. This presence didn't move or make a sound, yet everyone in the group felt a cold chill wash over them whenever they turned their heads in that direction. They stopped trying to sleep, staying awake in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on delirium. The third day was defined by a total loss of time perception. According to their watches, only 2 hours passed between sunrise and sunset, yet they felt they had been walking for an eternity through a landscape that had become increasingly alien. The familiar flora of West Virginia had been replaced by strange, pale fungi and twisted gray wood that looked petrified. They came across a small creek that was flowing uphill, defying gravity in a slow, viscous crawl over jagged rocks. No one dared to touch the water, fearing that the laws of physics in this pocket of the wilderness had completely collapsed. The lead hiker later recalled that his mind felt like it was being compressed, filled with static and fragmented memories of places he had never been. They eventually stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin that wasn't marked on any of their topographical maps. The structure was built from logs that looked far too large for any human to have moved, and it lacked windows or a chimney. Despite the heat of the afternoon, a thick frost covered the doorframe, and the air surrounding the cabin was cold enough to see their breath. One member of the group insisted they go inside for shelter, but as he approached the door, he stopped dead in his tracks and refused to move. He later described hearing hundreds of voices whispering from inside the wood itself, all of them speaking in a language that sounded like grinding stones and rushing water. They retreated from the cabin, moving with a desperate energy they didn't know they still possessed. As they fled the vicinity of the cabin, the forest suddenly snapped back into a recognizable state. The compasses jerked back to north, the birds began to sing again, and the trail they had been looking for appeared directly in front of them as if it had been there the whole time. They ran for miles, not stopping until they reached the gravel parking lot where their vehicles were stationed. When they checked the date on the dashboard of their car, they realized they had been missing for 8 days, not the 4 they had planned or the 3 they had perceived. Their bodies were malnourished and covered in scratches, but they had no memory of the additional 4 days that had vanished from their lives. Local authorities conducted a brief investigation after the hikers reported their experience, but search parties found nothing unusual in the area where the group claimed to have been lost. There were no strange cabins, no magnetic anomalies, and no evidence of a creek that flowed uphill. The official report chalked the incident up to mass hysteria triggered by dehydration and the disorienting nature of the deep wilderness. However, the hikers remained adamant that what they experienced was a physical reality, not a mental breakdown. One of them never fully recovered, spending years in and out of clinics, claiming that he could still hear the grinding voices of the trees whenever the wind picked up. The mystery of the Cranberry Wilderness incident remains a quiet legend among local woodsmen and researchers of the unexplained. Some suggest the area sits on a geological fault line that occasionally leaks exotic gases, causing hallucinations and time distortion. Others believe the Appalachian Mountains are far older than the life forms currently inhabiting them, and that the land itself occasionally tires of human presence, folding in on itself to hide away from the modern world. The hikers involved have all refused to return to the forest, and most of them have moved away from the region entirely, unable to look at the rolling green hills without feeling the weight of that missing time pressing down on their chests. The woods remain there, vast and indifferent, holding on to whatever occurred in that clearing during those 8 lost days. Deep in the archives of regional newspapers, there are sporadic accounts from the 1920s and 1950s that mirror the 1994 event with startling accuracy. Hunters described finding themselves in valleys that didn't exist, where the sun stayed in the same spot for 12 hours and the trees had no leaves despite it being the height of summer. These accounts were often dismissed as tall tales or the ramblings of men who had spent too much time alone in the brush. Yet, when placed side by side with the 1994 testimony, a pattern emerges of a recurring phenomenon that seems to target those who venture too far off the established paths. It is a reminder that the maps we rely on are only as good as the reality they represent, and sometimes that reality is more fluid than we are comfortable admitting. The physical evidence of the hiker's ordeal was limited to their deteriorated health and the strange metallic residue found on their clothing, which laboratory tests were unable to identify as any known industrial lubricant or natural sap. The residue was non-toxic, but had a crystalline structure that seemed to vibrate when exposed to certain frequencies of sound. This small detail was never included in the public reports, buried instead in a technical file that few have ever accessed. It suggests that whatever they encountered had a physical presence, something that could leave a mark on the world even if the world wasn't ready to acknowledge it. For the people who lived through it, the lack of an official explanation is a secondary concern to the fact that they survived at all. The forest doesn't offer up its secrets easily, and the Monongahela National Forest is a place of deep shadows and even deeper history. The indigenous tribes that once moved through these mountains spoke of places where the veil between worlds was thin, where a person could step behind a tree and emerge in a land that didn't know the sun. These warnings have been forgotten by the modern world, replaced by a sense of dominance over nature that is easily shattered when the compass fails and the trail disappears. The hikers were lucky to have found their way back, a feat that not everyone who goes missing in the Appalachians manages to accomplish. Each year, people vanish in these woods without a trace, leaving behind only empty campsites and unanswered questions. When we look at the vast stretches of wilderness remaining in the United States, we like to think of them as managed resources or recreational playgrounds. But stories like this suggest they are something else, entirely remnants of a primordial world that operates on a logic we no longer understand. The experience in the Cranberry Wilderness wasn't a crime, and it wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. It was an encounter with the unknown in its purest form, a reminder that there are still places on this earth where we are not the primary inhabitants. The mountains stand as silent witnesses to these events, their ancient peaks watching over the valleys where time and space sometimes forget to behave. The lasting impact on the witnesses is perhaps the most documented aspect of the case. They didn't just lose time, they lost their sense of security in the physical world. One hiker reported that for years afterward, he couldn't stand to be in a room with a ticking clock, as the steady rhythm reminded him of the erratic, stuttering heartbeat of the forest during their third day. Another became obsessed with mapping the area using satellite imagery, looking for any sign of the log cabin or the uphill creek, but the digital eyes in the sky showed only an unbroken sea of green. The frustration of knowing something happened, but being unable to prove it, is a specific kind of haunting that doesn't require a ghost. In the end, the Appalachian incident of 1994 serves as a modern folktale, a cautionary story for those who think they can master the wild. It sits in the gray area between science and myth, where witness perception is the only evidence we have of things that shouldn't be possible. As the years pass, the details might blur, and the survivors might stop talking about it, but the forest remains. It waits for the next group of hikers to wander a little too far, to ignore the silence, and to step into a clearing where the rules of the world no longer apply. The mountain doesn't care if you believe in it, it only cares that you are there. The silence that the group first noticed has been described by acoustic experts as a possible acoustic shadow, a rare phenomenon where sound waves are diverted by atmospheric conditions or complex terrain. While this might explain the lack of noise, it fails to account for the visual distortions, the magnetic failure, and the discrepancy in time. The psychological theory of folie à plusieurs, or shared psychosis, is often cited in cases of group sightings, suggesting that one person's fear can trigger hallucinations in others. But even that theory struggles with the 8-day disappearance and the physical toll on the hikers' bodies. Each explanation covers a fragment of the truth, but leaves the core of the experience untouched. Observers of the paranormal often point to the high concentration of iron and quartz in the Appalachian Range as a possible catalyst for strange events. These minerals can conduct and store energy in ways that are still being studied, potentially creating localized pockets of electromagnetic interference. If the conditions are exactly right, it is theorized that these pockets could cause a sensory overload or even a rift in how we perceive the passage of time. Whether this is what happened in West Virginia is a matter of speculation, but it provides a framework for understanding how a natural environment could produce such an unnatural experience. The land is not just a backdrop, it is an active participant in the story. The cabin the hikers encountered remains the most chilling detail for those who study the case. In many similar reports of missing time in the wilderness, witnesses describe seeing structures that don't belong buildings, that look too old, too new, or constructed from impossible materials. These phantom structures often act as a focal point for the most intense experiences before vanishing entirely. If the cabin in the Cranberry Wilderness was such a place, it suggests that the environment was projecting a physical manifestation of the group's internal dread, or that they had briefly entered a layer of reality where the cabin was a permanent fixture. Either way, the decision to not enter the structure likely saved their lives, or at least their sanity. The final report from the lead hiker ended with a simple statement that has since been quoted in various independent journals. He wrote that he no longer felt like a visitor in the woods, but like a trespasser who had been caught and then released for reasons he would never know. That feeling of being an unwelcome guest in a vast, ancient house is something that many who spend time in the deep Appalachians can relate to. There is a sense of age there that predates human concern, a weight of millions of years that makes our modern lives feel incredibly fragile. When the mountains decide to remind us of that scale, they do so with a terrifying and quiet efficiency. As we move further into the 21st century, with GPS and constant connectivity, the idea of getting lost in time seems like a relic of the past. But the 1994 incident reminds us that technology is only as good as the reality it is plugged into. If the environment itself changes, the tools we use to measure it become useless. The hikers had the best equipment available at the time, and it failed them completely the moment they stepped into that acoustic shadow. It is a humbling thought that for all our progress, we are still subject to the whims of the earth and the strange, unresolved pockets of mystery that it chooses to keep. The story of the lost hikers of West Virginia is not a ghost story, and it is not a story of a monster in the dark. It is a story about the land itself, and the way it can sometimes turn a mirror back on us, showing us how little we actually know about the world we inhabit. The unresolved tension of the case lies in the fact that it could happen again tomorrow to anyone with a backpack and a sense of adventure. The Monongahela National Forest continues to draw thousands of visitors every year, most of whom have a wonderful, uneventful time. But the clearing is still out there, somewhere in the dense spruce and rhododendron, waiting for the sun to rise in the west and the voices to start whispering from the wood. In the decades since, the survivors have mostly stayed out of the spotlight, preferring to move on from a week that cost them so much. The few interviews they gave in the late 90s are the primary source of our understanding, providing a vivid and consistent picture of a reality gone wrong. They don't look for fame or validation, they just want to live in a world where the compass points north and the days last 24 hours. Their experience serves as a silent landmark in the history of the American paranormal, a documented event that defies easy categorization and refuses to be forgotten. The Appalachian Mountains keep their secrets, but they sometimes leave a few survivors behind to tell the tale. The weather patterns in that part of West Virginia are notoriously fickle, often shifting from clear skies to dense fog in a matter of minutes. Meteorologists have studied the region's microclimates, noting that the deep valleys can trap air and create unique atmospheric lenses. While this can explain some of the visual distortions reported by hikers over the years, it doesn't touch the depth of the 1994 experience The hikers weren't just seeing things through a fog, they were interacting with a world that had fundamentally altered its behavior. The fog they experienced wasn't made of water vapor. It was a fog of the mind and of time itself. The legacy of the incident has influenced how some outdoor enthusiasts approach the Appalachian backcountry. There are now groups who specifically look for these thin places, using sensors and cameras to try and catch a glimpse of the shifting reality the hikers described. So far, they have found nothing but the same beautiful, rugged wilderness that has always been there. It seems the phenomenon isn't something that can be hunted or summoned. It is something that happens to you when you are least prepared for it. It is a spontaneous collapse of the expected, a momentary glitch in the grand machinery of the natural world. As the sun sets over the ridges of the Monongahela today, the shadows still stretch long across the forest floor. The wind still whistles through the needles of the high-altitude spruce trees, and the creeks still tumble over ancient stones. To most, it is a place of peace and renewal. But for those who know the story of the 1994 trek, the beauty of the landscape is tempered by a lingering question. What happens when the forest stops being a place and starts being a presence? The answer is buried somewhere in those 8 missing days, in the silence of a campfire that wouldn't crackle and the memory of a cabin that wasn't there. The final takeaway from this event is the importance of witness testimony in the face of the unexplainable. Without the detailed accounts provided by the hikers, this would have been just another missing persons case that ended with a fortunate discovery. Instead, it is a documented exploration into the limits of human perception and the potential for the world to be far more complex than our maps suggest. The hikers' bravery in sharing their story, despite the inevitable skepticism, has provided a valuable data point for anyone trying to understand the mysteries of the American wilderness. They remind us that the most frightening things aren't always what we find in the dark, but what we find when the light itself starts to change. The case remains open in the minds of many, a puzzle with pieces that will never quite fit together. There is no closure to be found in a story where the primary antagonist is the landscape itself. There are only theories, whispers, and the enduring silence of the mountains. Those who walk the trails of the cranberry wilderness today do so in the footsteps of those who came before, perhaps unaware that they are treading on ground that once forgot how to be real. The Appalachian Mountains don't let you leave easily, and for some, they never truly let go at all. The metallic taste, the ringing in the ears, and the visual bruises in the sky are all hallmarks of intense electromagnetic exposure, yet no source for such energy has ever been identified in that wilderness. It is as if the Earth itself generated a pulse that temporarily rewrote the local laws of physics. If such a thing is possible, it suggests that our planet has systems and cycles that we haven't even begun to map. We are like ants walking across a circuit board, unaware of the power flowing beneath our feet until a spark jumps and changes our world forever. The hikers were caught in that spark, and they carry the heat of it with them to this day. Ultimately, the 1994 Appalachian incident stands as a testament to the enduring power of the unknown. In an age where everything is recorded and analyzed, it is a rare thing to encounter a mystery that remains so stubbornly unresolved. It challenges our desire for neat endings and scientific certainty, leaving us instead with the raw, unsettling reality of an experience that shouldn't have happened. The mountains are old, far older than our records and our reasons, and they will likely be there long after our stories have faded into the soil. Until then, we listen to the whispers in the trees and watch the compass, hoping it stays true. The group's decision to stay together was likely the only reason they all made it out. In many other cases of missing time or spatial distortion, individuals who become separated are often never seen again or are found miles away in areas that should have been impossible for them to reach on foot. The collective strength of the hikers provided a psychological anchor that kept them grounded even as their surroundings became untethered. It highlights the social nature of our reality. we rely on each other to confirm that what we are seeing is real. When that reality starts to fray, the presence of others is the only thing that keeps us from drifting away with it. So, the next time you find yourself in the deep woods and the birds suddenly stop singing, take a moment to check your compass. If the needle starts to spin and the trail behind you looks a little too overgrown, remember the hikers of the Monongahela. The world is a vast place, and not all of it has been tamed by the lines we draw on our maps. Some parts of the mountains still belong to the silence, and that silence has a memory that stretches back to the beginning of time. Stay on the path, watch the sun, and listen for the sound of your own footsteps, because in the Appalachians, the mountains are always watching back. In this new story, you don't whistle at night in Appalachia. The dense forests and ancient ridges of the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States have long been the subject of reports involving auditory anomalies that defy standard acoustic explanation. Local archives and regional newspaper records from the late 20th century contain numerous accounts of hikers and residents experiencing sounds that appeared to mimic human distress or familiar voices with unsettling precision. These incidents are frequently documented in the high-altitude regions of the Blue Ridge and Great Smoky Mountains, where the complex topography creates unpredictable echoing patterns. Witnesses often describe a specific phenomenon where a familiar voice is heard calling from a location that is physically inaccessible or demonstrably empty at the time. Park officials and researchers have historically attributed these reports to a combination of wind shear, local wildlife like mountain lions, and the psychological effects of prolonged isolation in deep wilderness environments. In the summer of 1994, a research assistant named Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote section of the Great Smoky Mountains to conduct a survey of local migratory patterns. Thorne was a 29-year-old graduate student with extensive experience in wilderness survival and field observation who was used to spending long periods alone in the woods. He was assigned to a high-elevation ridge that remained largely undisturbed by commercial tourism or heavy hiking traffic due to its difficult terrain. His primary objective was to maintain a series of acoustic recording stations designed to capture the vocalizations of rare bird species for a university study. The environment was characterized by steep inclines and dense laurel thickets, and a persistent fog that often reduced visibility to less than 30 feet during the early morning hours. Thorne lived in a small state-owned cabin that was accessible only by a narrow packed trail and remained miles away from the nearest paved road or permanent human settlement. According to archived field notes recovered from the Regional Forestry Department, the first week of the assignment passed without any significant deviation from standard operating procedure. Thorne recorded routine environmental data and maintained his equipment according to the strict protocols established by the university research team. On the evening of July 12th, the weather shifted as a localized thermal inversion trapped a heavy layer of moisture against the high ridge. Thorne reported in his daily log that the forest became unusually silent, with a total absence of the typical insect and bird activity that usually defined the nights. At approximately 11:45 in the evening, he heard a sound originating from the deep ravine directly below the cabin porch that caught his attention. The sound was a clear and high-pitched whistle that appeared to be mimicking a tune he had been humming to himself earlier that afternoon. Thorne didn't immediately respond to the whistle because the distance and the vertical terrain made the presence of another person highly improbable at that late hour. He remained inside the cabin and observed the perimeter through the single window facing the dark ravine, but saw no movement. The whistling continued for nearly 20 minutes, repeating the same 4 notes at precise 60-second intervals without any variation. Each repetition lacked the natural breathiness of a human whistle, sounding more like a synthesized or mechanical reproduction played through a speaker. Regional dispatch logs from that night show no reports of missing persons or emergency signals in the surrounding 30-mile radius of the ridge. Thorne noted in his journal that the sound appeared to stay at a fixed point despite the swirling wind that should have caused the audio to drift across the valley. The following morning, Thorne conducted a physical inspection of the ravine to identify any signs of a human presence or discarded electronic equipment that might explain the noise. He found no footprints in the soft mud and no broken vegetation that'd indicate someone had navigated the steep and rocky slope during the night. The laurel thickets remained undisturbed, and there was no evidence of a campfire or temporary shelter anywhere in the immediate vicinity of the cabin. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Thorne reported a persistent sensation of being watched from the thick tree line by something he couldn't see. He noted that the biometric sensors on his recording equipment had registered several high-frequency spikes during the time the whistling was audible to him. These spikes didn't correspond to any known animal vocalizations or the mechanical interference typically found in regional electronic equipment at the time. Over the next 3 nights, the auditory phenomenon escalated in both volume and complexity, according to the archived testimonies of university staff who later reviewed the field tapes. The whistling began to incorporate other sounds, including the specific metallic rattle of Thorne's own equipment and the low-frequency hum of the cabin generator. Thorne described the experience in his notes as a form of acoustic mirroring, where the environment seemed to be learning and reproducing his own daily sounds. He reported that the whistling would sometimes originate from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a disorienting surround sound effect that made it impossible to pinpoint a source. University records show that Thorne requested a temporary suspension of the project on July 15th, citing extreme sleep deprivation and environmental stress. His supervisor noted that Thorne sounded uncharacteristically frantic during their last radio check and before the final incident occurred. The peak unexplained incident occurred on the final night of Thorne's residence at the high-elevation ridge station during a particularly dense fog. At 2:30 in the morning, the cabin's external security lights were triggered by movement near the generator shed located 50 yards from the main structure. Thorne looked out the window and saw a tall and dark shape standing perfectly still at the very edge of the light's reach near the woods. The shape didn't have a defined heat signature according to the thermal sensors, appearing instead as a cold void against the warmer forest background. The whistling then started again from the direction of the shed, using a tone that was identical to Thorne's own voice as recorded on his field tapes. It didn't just whistle this time, but began to recite his most recent log entry, word for word, including the coughs and pauses he'd made while recording. Thorne barricaded the cabin door using a heavy wooden dresser and remained in the center of the room until the sun rose over the eastern peaks. He reported that the figure didn't move for 4 hours, remaining a static silhouette against the laurel thickets while the whistling continued. As soon as it was light enough to navigate the trail, Thorne abandoned the station and hiked the 12 miles back to the trailhead without stopping. He didn't stay to retrieve his personal belongings or the expensive recording equipment that was left scattered at the cabin site. Upon reaching the university field office, he was described by colleagues as being in a state of shock with altered perceptions of time and distance. He claimed that the 12-mile hike had felt like it lasted for several days, despite only taking 4 hours according to the watch on his wrist. A recovery team was sent to the ridge station 3 days later to retrieve the university property and investigate the claims made by Thorne. They found the cabin exactly as Thorne had described, with the door still barricaded from the inside and the furniture moved. The recording equipment was still functional, but all the audio files from the final 3 days had been replaced with high-amplitude white noise. This noise contained embedded frequencies that caused physical nausea and intense vertigo in the technicians who later attempted to analyze the data. No footprints were found around the generator shed, and the thermal cameras showed no record of the dark shape Thorne had observed that night. The forestry department officially listed the cause of the incident as a localized acoustic anomaly compounded by extreme psychological fatigue from isolation. State records from 1995 indicate that the ridge station was permanently decommissioned and the cabin was eventually dismantled by the Park Service. The university conducted a private review of the case, but never released a formal explanation for the audio distortions captured on the early tapes. Some local residents in the nearby town claimed that the ridge had a long history of being a dead zone where sounds behaved unnaturally. They spoke of the mountain having a way of swallowing voices and whistling them back out years later in altered and distorted forms. These accounts remain unverified by official scientific agencies, yet they persist in the regional folklore of the Appalachian Highlands to this day. Thorne himself never returned to the mountains and transitioned into a career in data analysis that didn't require any field work or wilderness travel. The case of Elias Thorne remains a point of contention among researchers of environmental psychology and regional wilderness phenomena in the United States. Some argue that the unique mineral composition of the ridge created a natural recording medium that could play back ambient sounds under specific conditions. Others point to the possibility of a rare type of infrasound caused by wind moving through the ravines, which is known to cause hallucinations and dread. Thorne reportedly maintained until his death that what he heard wasn't a hallucination, but a physical attempt by the environment to mimic him. He claimed the whistling was a way for whatever was out there to signal that it was learning how to appear more human. Archived notes from a county file in 2009 reveal that 2 other hikers reported similar auditory mirroring in the same general area years later. These later reports describe voices calling from the fog using the names of friends who were standing right next to the witnesses at the time. In each instance, the sounds were described as being just slightly off, possessing a metallic or digital quality that felt fundamentally wrong to the ear. Park authorities continue to advise hikers to stay on marked trails and to avoid following sounds that deviate from expected wilderness patterns. The phenomenon remains unresolved, existing in the space between documented acoustic anomaly and the enduring mysteries of the Appalachian wilderness. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to draw millions of visitors who seek the beauty of the high ridges and deep valleys every year. Most experiences are routine and peaceful, characterized by the natural beauty of the American Southeast without any strange occurrences. However, the records of the Thorne incident serve as a documented reminder that the wilderness can produce sensory experiences that defy standard logic. The ambiguity of the recordings and the lack of physical evidence leave the case open to interpretation by both skeptics and believers. Whether the sounds are the result of rare natural physics or a more unsettling presence remains a matter of ongoing debate in regional archives. Technicians who reviewed the final white noise tapes noted that the sound appeared to pulse with a rhythm that matched a human heartbeat. This detail was excluded from the official university report, but was leaked in a regional newspaper archive from 2001. The pulse was reportedly consistent across all 3 hours of the final recording, even as the volume of the noise fluctuated. This led some investigators to suggest that the recording equipment wasn't malfunctioning, but was instead capturing a biological signal from an unknown source. These claims were never substantiated by further field studies, as no researchers were willing to occupy the ridge station for extended periods after Thorne. In the years following the decommissioning of the station, the forest has largely reclaimed the site where the cabin once stood on the ridge. The pack trail has become overgrown with laurel thickets and is now nearly impossible to follow without specialized GPS equipment and heavy clearing. Despite the physical removal of the structures, the ridge remains a focal point for stories of whistling in the fog among the local community. Hikers occasionally report hearing their own names called from the ravines, but they're now more likely to ignore the sound than to investigate it. The legacy of the Thorne incident persists as a factual record of a time when the mountains appeared to talk back to a researcher. The psychological impact on the university staff involved in the recovery effort was significant, with several reporting recurring nightmares of being watched. They described a feeling of wrongness that permeated the cabin, as if the air itself had been altered by the events of that week. Official records show that 2 members of the recovery team resigned from their positions shortly after returning from the high ridge. They cited personal reasons, but colleagues noted their sudden and intense aversion to high elevation fieldwork following the assignment. These individual reactions highlight the disturbing nature of an experience that has no confirmed physical cause but leaves a lasting sensory imprint. Environmental researchers continue to study the Great Smoky Mountains for their unique acoustic properties and diverse biological signals in a controlled setting. The region remains a vital part of the American wilderness, offering insights into the complex interactions between terrain and sound propagation. However, the case of Elias Thorne stands as a unique entry in the archives, representing a moment where the interaction became hostile and unexplained. The missing audio and the conflicting testimonies of time distortion ensure that the incident will remain a topic of interest for years to come. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, and some of them are only heard by those who venture too far into the fog alone. The final log entry from Thorne's journal, dated July 16, 1994, contains a single sentence written in frantic handwriting. It states that the whistling in the ravine was finally correct, sounding exactly like his own voice from a recording he had made. This specific detail was never verified by the university, but was included in a first-hand account published in a regional mystery magazine years later. It adds a layer of personal disturbance to an already unsettling narrative, suggesting that the phenomenon had access to Thorne's own past. The ambiguity of this claim serves to further muddy the waters between a psychological breakdown and an objective external phenomenon. Investigators who attempted to replicate the acoustic spikes years later found that the ridge had returned to a normal baseline of sound. They were unable to capture any white noise or voice mimicry, even during similar atmospheric conditions and thermal inversions. This has led some to believe that the Thorne incident was a one-time event triggered by a specific and unknown combination of environmental variables. Others suggest that the mountain only speaks when it has a specific target to mirror and learn from over a period of time. The lack of recurring data makes it impossible to draw a definitive conclusion, leaving the ridge station's legacy in a state of permanent uncertainty. Thorne's equipment was eventually sold at a state auction, and its current whereabouts are unknown to the university archives or researchers. Some believe that the sensors themselves were permanently altered by the high-frequency spikes and the white noise recordings made that week. There's no official evidence to support this, but the story persists in the folklore surrounding the decommissioning of the high site. The ridge remains a silent part of the park's vast wilderness, a place where the trees grow tall over the secrets of 1994. The Appalachian wilderness continues to be a place of beauty and deep unresolved mystery for all who enter its boundaries. The records of the local historical society continue to be a primary source for those looking to understand the unsettling sounds of the ridge. They contain a collection of first-hand accounts and newspaper archives that spans several decades of regional history and folklore. Each entry contributes to a larger picture of an environment that doesn't always follow the expected laws of physics or acoustics. The Thorne incident is just one chapter in a much older narrative of sounds that call from the laurel thickets. It remains the best documented case due to the involvement of the university and the recovery of the field journals and equipment. Park officials occasionally conduct routine patrols of the area to ensure that no unauthorized camping or structures have been established on the ridge. These patrols are uneventful, reporting only the presence of local wildlife and the occasional overgrowth of the old pack trails. They don't report hearing voices or experiencing time distortion, suggesting that the phenomenon remains dormant or highly selective in its targets. The ridge is now just another coordinate on a map of millions of acres of protected wilderness in the American Southeast. However, for those who know the history of the Thorne case, the area remains a place of caution and unsettling memory. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest geological formations on Earth, and their deep valleys have seen centuries of human history. The folklore of the region is rich with stories of spirits and unexplained occurrences that date back to the earliest settlers of the area. The Thorn incident is a modern addition to this long tradition, blending technology with the ancient mysteries of the high ridges. It serves as a reminder that even in an age of digital recording and biometric sensors, the wilderness can remain fundamentally unknowable. The fog still rolls over, the laurel thickets, and the silence of the forest is still broken by sounds that can't be explained. The final university report on the project concluded that the Great Smoky Mountains survey was a failure due to environmental challenges. It didn't mention the whistling or the silhouette or the white noise tapes that caused physical illness in the university staff. The official narrative focuses on the logistical difficulties and the lack of useful biological data captured by the stations during the month. This omission has led to accusations of a cover-up among some members of the regional paranormal community over the years. However, without further access to the restricted archives, these claims remain entirely speculative and unsupported by physical evidence. Thorne's later years were spent in relative obscurity away from the public eye and the academic world of forestry research. He reportedly avoided any discussions about his time on the ridge, even with close friends and family members who asked. His journals were donated to the local historical society by his estate after his death in 2018 near his hometown. They remain the primary source for anyone looking to reconstruct the events of that final week in 1994 on the ridge. They're a window into a mind experiencing the impossible and a factual record of a phenomenon that has no official name. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park remains a testament to the power of nature and the importance of wilderness preservation in America. It's a place where millions find peace and connection with the natural world in the mountains of the Southeast. But it's also a place that holds records of events that defy the very science we use to study it. The case of the ridge station and the mimicked whistling is a permanent part of that landscape recorded in the archives of those who were there. It remains a disturbing, non-criminal incident that continues to intrigue and unsettle those who seek the truth about the ridge. Final review of the Thorn incident highlights the enduring ambiguity of witness perception in extreme and isolated environments. The lack of physical traces like footprints or camera footage of the entity makes it impossible to confirm an external presence. Yet the consistent audio anomalies and the physiological reactions of the staff point toward an objective event of some kind occurring. This tension between the seen and the heard is what defines the most unsettling cases in the Appalachian archives. The mountains continue to stand in silence, keeping their secrets from those who only walk the marked trails and stay in groups. If you hear a familiar whistle in the deep ravines of Appalachia, the local folklore suggests you should never answer back or investigate. The story of Elias Thorne is a factual reconstruction of why that belief exists in the first place among the mountain people. It's a narrative of a man who listened too closely to the sounds of the mountain and found something that had talked back. The ridge remains a silent monument to that experience, a place where the laurel thickets grow over the forgotten history of that summer. The wilderness is vast, and its memories are long and deep for those who know where to look in the records. Local records from the county sheriff's office also mention a series of abandoned vehicle reports near the trailhead during the same year. These vehicles belonged to hikers who were never officially reported missing, but whose belongings were found undisturbed at their campsites. One such vehicle contained a cassette tape that had been recorded over with a sound described as a rhythmic whistling tune. This tape was never linked to the Thorne case, but it shares the same unsettling acoustic qualities mentioned in the university's private review. These fragments of evidence suggest a pattern of behavior in the region that predates the establishment of the ridge station. They indicate that the phenomenon is a recurring element of the high Appalachian environment that occasionally intersects with human activity. The consistency of the 319 timestamp across several unrelated reports in the regional archives is a detail that remains unexplained by researchers. It appears in dispatch logs and personal journals as a moment when the auditory anomalies are most likely to peak in intensity. Some have suggested a link to local lunar cycles or specific atmospheric pressure changes that occur at that hour in the mountains. Others believe it's a structural element of the phenomenon itself, a specific window where the mirroring effect is most potent. Whatever the cause, the repetition of the timestamp adds a layer of mathematical precision to an otherwise chaotic and frightening experience. It serves as a marker for when the environment begins to actively engage with those who are listening in the dark. The story of the Ridge Station has become a cautionary tale for new research assistants entering the university's forestry program. They're advised to maintain regular communication and to report any unusual sensory experiences to their supervisors immediately without delay. While the university no longer maintains high elevation stations on that specific ridge, the lessons learned from the Thorn incident remain part of the training. They emphasize the importance of psychological health and the need to recognize when environmental stress is affecting objective data collection. The ridge itself remains off-limits for new academic studies, ensuring that the silence of the laurel thickets is not disturbed again. The Appalachian wilderness keeps its peace as long as the voices in the ravine are left without an answer. Final analysis of the biometric data recovered from Thorne's smartwatch showed that his sleep cycles were disrupted by external acoustic frequencies. These frequencies were below the threshold of human hearing, but were captured by the high-sensitivity microphones on the ridge. They appeared to oscillate in a pattern that is known to induce feelings of paranoia and extreme physical discomfort in human subjects. This suggests that the environment was producing a physical stimulus that directly affected Thorne's perception of the events he was recording. The origin of these frequencies remains a mystery, as no known geological or biological source in the region produces them. They stand as the only surviving physical evidence of the strange conditions that existed on the ridge in 1994. The Appalachian Trail continues to be a place of adventure and challenge for thousands of hikers who traverse its length every year. They walk through the ancient forests and over the high ridges, experiencing the majesty of the eastern mountains in all seasons. For most, the only sounds they hear are the wind in the trees and the calls of the local wildlife as they pass. But for a few, the silence of the woods is broken by a whistle or a voice that sounds far too familiar to be a coincidence. Those who know the history of the Thorn incident walk a little faster when the fog rolls in and the forest goes quiet. They know that in Appalachia, some sounds are better left ignored, and some questions are better left unasked in the dark. In this new story, she woke up to find handprints on the mattress next to her. The physical environment of a modern home is often perceived as a fixed and unchanging sanctuary, where the placement of objects remains constant throughout the night. Most people assume that any change in the topography of their living space requires a direct and identifiable force to act upon it. However, the forensic logs and archived digital images from a quiet residence in suburban Maryland suggest that some impressions are left by sources that defy immediate physical explanation. A routine morning of waking up can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when the evidence of a presence is literally pressed into the fabric of the bed. Juliana Vance was a 38-year-old forensic accountant who spent her professional hours analyzing complex financial data to identify patterns of fraud for federal agencies. She lived alone in a high-security townhome that she had recently purchased on the outskirts of a growing tech corridor. His primary goal for the year 2024 was to finalize a series of high-stakes audits that required her total and absolute focus during the day. Juliana was a woman of extreme objectivity, who relied on evidence and tangible data to navigate every aspect of her life. She followed a strict nightly routine of securing her home and calibrating her biometric sleep sensors before resting for the evening. The incident began on a humid Tuesday in the month of August in the year 2024, during a period of heavy coastal fog. Juliana woke up at precisely 3:19 in the morning and felt an unusual chill in the air that seemed to originate from the empty side of her king-sized bed. She turned on the bedside lamp and was startled to find a series of deep and fresh handprints pressed into the mattress topper right beside her. The impressions were large and clearly defined, as if someone had been leaning over her while she was in a deep state of sleep. She checked the bedroom door and confirmed it was still locked, and the motion sensors in the hallway had remained completely silent. She grabbed her professional-grade digital camera to document the impressions before the memory foam could return to its original and flat state. The forensic logs from the camera indicated that the handprints were exactly 11 inches in length and possessed a unique ridge pattern that did not match her own. Juliana felt a surge of cold adrenaline as she realized that the pressure required to create such deep marks would have necessitated a weight of at least 200 pounds. She immediately reviewed the local server logs for her security system and found that no exterior or interior alarms had been triggered during the night. The high-definition footage from the bedroom entrance showed the door remained closed and undisturbed for the entire duration of the storm. The next morning, Juliana began a step-by-step investigation of the property by reviewing the state records regarding the history of the original land plot. She was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every structural change and utility maintenance that had been performed on the townhome. She discovered that the residential neighborhood was built on the site of a former industrial laundry facility that had operated during the 1950s. According to the archive notes from a county file from 2009, the facility had experienced a major steam pipe explosion that resulted in several fatalities. The archives indicated that one of the victims was a maintenance foreman who was reportedly found near the area where her bedroom was now located. She searched the digital archives of the local historical society and found a series of recordings from the early development of the suburban corridor. These files described a man named Silas Thorne who was known for his habit of checking the temperature of the industrial equipment with his bare hands. Silas had reportedly survived for several hours after the explosion and was described as having a grip that left permanent marks on the metal pipes he held. The witness statements from the original investigation mentioned that the foreman was often seen patrolling the site of the laundry even after the facility was closed and demolished. Juliana realized that the handprints on her mattress matched the anatomical descriptions of the foreman's large and scarred hands in the report. The forensic images from the incident were reviewed by an independent consultant who found that the temperature of the mattress in the impressions was 15 degrees lower than the surrounding fabric. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a physical intruder within the townhome, and the biometric sensors showed Juliana's heart rate had spiked only after she woke up. Records conflict regarding the exact location of the steam pipe explosion, but some locals claimed the site was prone to unusual thermal anomalies and cold spots. Juliana decided to keep a thermal imaging camera active in her bedroom and continued to monitor the mattress for any signs of recurring pressure. She kept the original forensic logs on a secure drive as a record of the night that her sanctuary was breached by a weightless force. The townhome remains occupied today as Juliana continues her work with a new focus on the environmental anomalies of her living space. She still reviews the high-definition images of the handprints occasionally, but she remains unable to find a mechanical or structural reason for the localized depressions. The final report is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple physical or psychological explanation in the modern world. She sleeps with a secondary light source now because she knows that some impressions are left by those who are no longer there to explain them. Some properties carry a memory that is pressed into the very materials we use to find comfort in the quiet of the night. The engineering community still discusses the Juliana Vance case as an example of potential memory foam failure or localized atmospheric pressure changes in sealed environments. However, Juliana knows that what she photographed was not a material defect, but a factual record of a presence that was seeking a point of contact. She spends her time now researching the intersection of historical industrial sites and the modern residential structures that are built over the forgotten tragedies of the past. The townhome stands as a silent witness to the man who was still trying to find his way through the fog of a long-gone shift. She closes her laptop and turns off the desk lamp with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the weight of the past. The final entry in the county file regarding the industrial laundry explosion noted that the foreman was a man of immense dedication to his crew and his equipment. This detail suggests that the presence Juliana felt was not one of malice, but of a routine that had been repeated for thousands of days. It suggests that the room was acting as a resonance chamber for the final and most desperate moments of a man who refused to leave his post. Juliana believes that the handprints were a bridge between the past and the present that allowed a forgotten story to be seen one last time. The impressions beside her were merely a reminder that we are never truly the first to occupy the spaces we call our own. The quiet streets of Maryland rarely make the national news for anything other than routine political events and standard traffic reports for the busy corridor. Yet underneath the surface of the modern townhomes, there are stories that remain recorded in the deep layers of the local digital archives. Juliana Vance is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive for future study. She continues to document every anomaly with the same professional objectivity because she knows that the truth is often found in the smallest of details. The reality of the handprints is a mystery that requires us to acknowledge the things that we cannot simply explain away with logic. The study of the townhome's thermal resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under a restricted access report. No further impressions have been reported by Juliana, as the room's climate control system was updated to maintain a more consistent and stable environment throughout the night. The memory of the handprints on the mattress remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that locked and secure room. Juliana has moved on with her career, but she never forgets to check the surface of her bed every single morning when she first wakes up. She knows that the past is always looking for a way to leave a mark on the technology and the lives of the future. The legacy of the maintenance foreman is now a part of the local lore that the residents discuss in their private online forums during the long winter. They talk about the man who died in the explosion and the forensic accountant who found the heat of a ghost in her own bed. For Juliana, it isn't a story for a dinner party, but a technical record of a night that changed her understanding of the world around her. She continues to design her security protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a secure and private environment for her family. The walls are only the beginning of the defense against a world that we are still learning to measure in the darkness. The final report on the property noted that the foundation had experienced a localized cooling effect due to the proximity of the old industrial drainage system. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the thermal anomalies that Juliana had originally sought to quantify with her professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a heat sink for the forgotten machinery that still sits buried deep beneath the modern flooring and walls. Juliana looks at the floor and wonders how many other people are sleeping on top of the stories of those who built the world. She understands now that the most important evidence is often the kind that vanishes before the sun has a chance to rise. The townhome remains a dark silhouette against the foggy Maryland skyline, while the forensic accountant continues to search for the patterns in the data. Juliana Vance keeps her focus on the numbers, but she is always watching for the shape of a hand that doesn't belong to her. She knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right moment to be seen by an objective and patient observer. The silence of the morning is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everything that happened before she arrived. She sleeps soundly now, knowing that the watchman has finally left his mark and found his way back into the archives of the past. They went camping, but the forest was hunting them. The vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest is a place of breathtaking beauty and immense silent danger. It is a land of towering ancient trees and deep valleys that have never been touched by modern hands. Two experienced hikers named Elias and Mara planned a week-long trip into this remote and isolated region. They wanted to escape the constant noise of the city and the pressure of their demanding corporate jobs. The year was 2016, and they were looking for a complete digital detox from the modern world. They parked their vehicle at a lonely trailhead that was miles away from the nearest paved road. The car was the only vehicle in the small gravel lot, which suggested they would be completely alone. They checked their gear one last time to ensure they had enough food and water for the journey. Elias carried a heavy pack with the tent and the cooking equipment, while Mara carried the medical supplies. The weather report called for clear skies and mild temperatures for the entire duration of their planned trip. They stepped onto the narrow dirt path and disappeared into the dense green wall of the forest. The silence of the woods was immediate, and it felt heavy, like a physical weight on their shoulders. The sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of pine needles and left the forest floor in shadow. Their simple goal for that day was to reach a specific ridgeline that offered a panoramic view. They hiked for 6 hours over rough terrain and crossed several cold streams that flowed from the mountains. They set up their camp in a small clearing that was surrounded on all sides by thick brush. Elias built a small fire, while Mara set up the tent and arranged their sleeping bags for the night. The sun went down quickly, and the temperature dropped just as fast in the high-altitude air. They ate a simple meal of dehydrated food and sat by the fire watching the sparks float upward. The darkness that descended on the woods was absolute and swallowed the light from their small fire completely. The first night was peaceful, but Mara woke up to the sound of something walking near the tent. It sounded like two heavy feet crunching on the dry leaves rather than the four paws of an animal. She woke Elias, but the sound stopped the moment he sat up and turned on his flashlight. They scanned the perimeter of their campsite, but saw nothing but the dark trunks of the massive trees. They dismissed the noise as a deer or a bear and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, they packed up their camp and prepared to hike further into the deep woods. They planned to follow a marked trail that would lead them in a wide loop back to their car. They noticed that a few of their items seemed to have been moved during the night while they slept. Elias found his water bottle on the other side of the fire pit from where he left it. They assumed they were just forgetful and laughed it off as they put on their heavy packs. The hike that day felt different as the woods seemed to become denser and harder to navigate. They followed the small plastic markers nailed to the trees that were supposed to guide hikers along the trail. After 4 hours of walking, they realized that the terrain did not match the map they were carrying. The map showed a flat valley, but they were climbing a steep and rocky hill with no end. Elias checked his compass and realized they were heading north when they should have been heading south. They were confused because they had been following the trail markers perfectly since they left the campsite that morning. They decided to backtrack to the last known landmark to figure out where they had made a mistake. The return trip was difficult, and the feeling of being watched began to grow in both of their minds. Mara mentioned that the forest felt too quiet, as there were no birds singing in the trees. The usual sounds of squirrels and insects were absent, and the silence was unnerving and very intense. They arrived back at the fork in the trail where they had started the climb hours earlier. They were shocked to find that the trail marker they had followed was no longer on the tree. The plastic diamond was gone, and there were no nail holes in the bark of the pine tree. Panic began to set in as they realized that the trail markers might have been deliberately moved or tampered with. They checked the map again and tried to use the distant mountain peaks to orient themselves in the woods. They decided to set up camp early because the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. They chose a spot that was defensible with a large rock wall at their backs for protection. They built a larger fire that night and kept a pile of heavy rocks inside the tent. They did not sleep well as every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep in the dark. The incident that changed everything happened just after 3 o'clock in the morning on the second night. A large rock was thrown from the darkness, and it hit the side of their tent with force. Elias shouted and unzipped the tent door with his flashlight beam cutting through the black night air. He saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was tall and appeared to be covered in leaves and branches like a military sniper suit. The figure did not move or run away, but simply stood there, watching them with a terrifying stillness. Elias grabbed a burning branch from the fire and threw it toward the figure to scare it away. The figure melted back into the shadows of the forest without making a single sound on the leaves. They realized they were not dealing with an animal, but with a human who was stalking them. They packed their camp in a frenzy and decided to hike out in the dark using their headlamps. It was a dangerous decision to hike at night, but staying in the clearing felt like a death sentence. They moved quickly through the brush and tried to keep their lights pointed at the ground to hide. The complication was that the forest seemed to be fighting against their escape at every single turn. They found piles of rocks blocking the path that had not been there just the day before. Large branches were pulled down across the trail to slow them down and force them to go around. They felt like they were being herded like cattle toward a specific destination that they did not know. They could hear whistles communicating from the left and the right sides of the trail in the distance. The whistles were mimicking bird calls, but they were too rhythmic and mechanical to be from real birds. They abandoned the trail completely and decided to bushwhack straight down the side of the mountain toward a road. They moved as fast as they could while tearing their clothes on the sharp thorns of the bushes. Mara fell and twisted her ankle, but the adrenaline in her system kept her moving without feeling pain. They could hear the heavy footsteps of their pursuers getting closer behind them in the dark woods. The people chasing them were not using flashlights, which meant they knew the terrain perfectly in the dark. This realization made the situation even more terrifying as they stumbled blindly down the steep slope. They reached a wide stream and waded through the freezing water to try and hide their scent trail. They hid under a large overhang of the riverbank and turned off their headlamps to wait and listen. They heard three people cross the stream just a few yards away from where they were hiding. The pursuers were speaking in a language that sounded like English, but the words were strange and distorted. They were talking about trapping the hikers in the Box Canyon further down the stream to the east. Elias and Mara realized they had narrowly avoided walking into a prepared ambush set by these unknown people. They waited for an hour in the freezing water until the voices faded away into the distance. They climbed out of the stream and moved in the opposite direction of the trap toward the west. The sun began to rise, and the gray light of dawn revealed the exhaustion on their faces. They found an old logging road that was overgrown with grass, but clearly led out of the forest. They walked for 10 miles on the logging road until they reached a paved county highway. A passing truck driver saw them waving their arms and stopped to pick them up on the road. The investigation began immediately after the truck driver took them to the nearest small-town sheriff's station. The local police were skeptical of their story at first because of the lack of physical evidence. However, the sheriff sent a team of deputies to the trailhead to check on their vehicle. The car had been vandalized and the tires were slashed, which confirmed that someone was indeed there. The police organized a search party to go into the woods and find the campsite and the pursuers. They found the campsite where the rock had been thrown, and they found strange footprints in the mud. The footprints were made by boots that had been wrapped in burlap to muffle the sound of walking. The search team also found the trail markers that had been pried off the trees and moved. The investigation revealed a network of illegal camps hidden deep in the forest valleys near the trail. These camps were camouflaged so well that a person could walk right past them without seeing anything. The camps were filled with stolen camping gear and driver licenses from people who had gone missing. This discovery turned a simple harassment case into a potential serial murder investigation involving federal agents. The twist and the payoff came when the police analyzed the contents of the hidden camps. They found detailed journals that described the hunt of various hikers over the past 5 years. The people living in the woods were not just hermits, but a group of individuals who hunted humans. They viewed the forest as their territory, and the hikers as intruders who were fair game for sport. The group used the natural terrain to funnel hikers into traps where they could be easily captured. The police realized that Elias and Mara had survived only because they left the trail when they did. The authorities launched a massive raid on the forest, using helicopters and tactical teams to clear the area. They arrested 4 individuals who were living in the primitive shelters and wearing homemade camouflage suits. The suspects were socially isolated and had created their own distorted society deep in the wilderness. They had no identification and refused to speak to the investigators about their activities in the woods. The police found maps that showed the trails had been manipulated for years to confuse tourists. The scale of the operation was terrifying because it happened in a public park visited by thousands. The button of the story is the lingering fear that stays with the couple years later. Elias and Mara returned to the city, but they never went camping in the wilderness ever again. They sold all of their hiking gear and spent their vacations in crowded beach resorts with security. The experience taught them that the silence of nature is not always peaceful, but can be predatory. The forest is a place where civilization ends, and the rules of survival are the only law. They often think about the other hikers who did not turn off the trail in time. The case remains a disturbing reminder of the dangers that can exist in the blind spots of the map. The vastness of the American wilderness provides ample space for people to hide and do terrible things. The trail markers that we trust to lead us to safety are only as reliable as the hands that place them. When you step into the deep woods, you are entering a world where you are no longer the top predator. The eyes that watched from the tree line were not animals, but something far more dangerous and calculating. And somewhere in the deep woods, there are likely more camps that have never been found. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound and required years of therapy to manage the trauma. They both suffer from nightmares where they are back in the tent hearing the heavy footsteps outside. The sound of wind in the trees triggers a panic response that makes them freeze in place. They learn the hard way that the digital detox they wanted came with a very high price. The disconnect from the world meant that no one could hear them scream when the trouble started. It is a lesson in preparedness and the importance of trusting your instincts when things feel wrong. The story of their survival is now used as a case study in outdoor survival courses. Instructors teach students to trust their compass over trail markers, which can be moved or destroyed. They teach that if the woods go silent, it means a predator is near and you should leave. The intuition that Elias and Mara felt was a primal warning system that saved their lives that night. The modern world dulls these instincts, but they are still there waiting to be used in emergencies. The line between a tragedy and a survival story is often just a single decision made in the dark. The forest has grown back over the illegal camps, and the trails have been corrected by the rangers. The parking lot at the trailhead is still there, and people still park their cars to go hiking. New hikers enter the woods every day unaware of the history of the ground they are walking on. They see the beauty of the trees and the mountains, but they do not see the history. The wilderness keeps its secrets well and covers the scars of the past with new growth. But for those who know the story, the wind in the trees sounds a little different. It sounds like a warning to stay on the path and to keep watching the shadows. It sounds like the footsteps of the people who claimed the forest as their own private hunting ground. The wilderness is indifferent to our safety, and it demands respect from those who enter. The couple survived because they realized in time that they were prey and not just tourists. They beat the forest at its own game by becoming unpredictable and moving through the wild. And they walked out of the darkness and back into the light of the living world. The road that vanishes in the snow. True tales of highway horror. The winter of 2014 went down in the record books as one of the most brutal seasons in decades. A massive polar vortex had descended upon the northern states and turned the entire region into a frozen wasteland of ice. The highways that crossed the mountain passes were treacherous sheets of black ice that claimed unwary drivers every single day. Silas was a long-haul trucker who had spent 30 years driving the most dangerous routes in the country without an accident. He was driving a heavy 18-wheeler loaded with perishable goods that needed to reach the distribution center by morning. The interstate was officially closed due to a massive pileup involving 20 cars that had happened an hour earlier. Silas pulled his massive rig into a small truck stop that sat on the edge of the closure zone. He walked into the diner to get a cup of black coffee and look at his paper maps. The digital GPS on his dashboard was recalculating a route, but it kept trying to send him back to the closed highway. An old man sitting at the counter noticed Silas looking at the map and leaned over to offer some advice. He told Silas about a secondary state road that cut through the valley and bypassed the mountain closure completely. The old man claimed the road was kept clear by the local logging companies and was safe for a heavy truck. Silas was skeptical at first, but the pressure of the deadline and the perishable cargo weighed heavily on his mind. He thanked the stranger and finished his coffee before walking back out into the biting cold wind and snow. He climbed into the warm cab of his truck and programmed the secondary route into his mind using the map. The road was called State Route 9, and it appeared as a thin gray line winding through the dense forest. He put the truck into gear and pulled out of the lot, leaving the safety of the lights behind. The snow was falling harder now, and the large flakes swirled in the headlights like millions of white insects. The first hour of the drive on the new route was slow, but the road was indeed plowed and wide enough. Silas relaxed a little and turned up the radio to listen to a classic rock station to stay awake. The heater hummed a steady rhythm and the wipers slapped back and forth, clearing the accumulating snow from the glass. He felt confident that he would make the delivery on time and prove that he was still the best driver. The road began to climb higher into the hills, and the trees pressed in closer to the edge of the pavement. The pavement turned from black asphalt to packed snow and ice as he moved further away from civilization. The radio signal began to fade into static and eventually cut out completely, leaving him in silence with the engine. He noticed that he had not seen another car or truck for at least 40 minutes on this road. The isolation was absolute, and the only light in the world came from his own high beams cutting the dark. The road narrowed significantly as it wound around the side of a steep cliff with a drop on the right. Silas slowed the truck down to a crawl as he navigated the tight turns with the heavy trailer behind him. He saw a sign that was covered in snow, and he could not read the warning that was printed underneath. He rounded a sharp bend and slammed on his brakes as a dark shape appeared in the middle of the road. The truck slid on the ice for a few terrifying seconds before coming to a stop just feet from the obstacle. It was a dark sedan that was parked sideways across both lanes, blocking the entire path forward for the truck. Silas sat in the cab for a moment, with his heart pounding in his chest and his hands gripping the wheel. He expected to see the driver of the car get out and wave for help or explain the situation. The car remained dark and silent, with no movement inside and the snow piling up on the roof and hood. Silas flashed his high beams to signal the driver, but there was no reaction from the vehicle in front of him. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and a tire iron from under his seat before opening the driver door. The cold air hit him like a physical blow, and the wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal. He climbed down from the high cab, and his boots crunched loudly on the frozen surface of the road. He walked slowly toward the car, with the beam of his flashlight cutting through the swirling snow and darkness. He reached the car and shined the light into the driver's side window, expecting to see a sleeping or injured person. The car was completely empty, and there were no keys in the ignition and no personal items on the seats. Silas tried the door handle and found it unlocked, so he opened the door to investigate the interior further. The interior light flickered on and revealed a clean car that looked like it had been abandoned for hours. He looked at the floor mats and noticed they were wet, which meant someone had been in the car recently. He stepped back and shined his light on the road around the car to look for footprints in the snow. He found a set of tracks leading away from the car and disappearing into the dense woods on the left. The tracks were strange because they were widely spaced, as if the person had been running in a panic. Silas felt a deep sense of unease settle in his stomach as he realized this was not a simple breakdown. He looked further up the road past the blocked car and saw something that made his blood run cold. There was another vehicle parked on the side of the road about 50 yards ahead that was almost buried. And beyond that one, he could see the faint outline of a third vehicle that was completely covered in snow. This was not a road that was used for travel, but a graveyard for cars that had been lured here. Silas turned around to run back to his truck and get on the radio to call for immediate help. He stopped in his tracks when he saw a figure standing near the rear tires of his own trailer. The figure was wearing white camouflage clothing that blended perfectly with the snow and made him almost invisible. The man was holding a long object that looked like a rifle or a shotgun in his gloved hands. Silas dove behind the abandoned sedan just as a loud crack echoed through the valley and a bullet hit the car. The glass of the rear window shattered and showered the back seat with tiny diamonds of safety glass. Silas scrambled on his hands and knees to the front of the car to put the engine block between him and the shooter. He realized that the old man at the diner had sent him into a trap that was set for travelers. The road was a hunting ground for a group of highway pirates who preyed on trucks and isolated cars during storms. They used the weather and the road closures to funnel victims onto this dead-end path where they could be robbed. Silas knew he had to get back to his truck if he wanted to survive the night in this freezing hell. He peeked around the front bumper and saw two more figures emerging from the tree line on the right side. They were moving tactically and communicating with hand signals, which meant they were organized and experienced in this type of ambush. Silas knew he could not outrun them in the deep snow, and he could not fight three armed men alone. He needed a distraction that would allow him to cover the distance to his truck cab in a few seconds. He opened the hood of the sedan and found the battery terminals were still connected and the battery looked new. He used his tire iron to create a spark against the metal frame, but it was not enough to cause a fire. He remembered the road flare he had in his heavy winter coat pocket for emergencies just like this one. He pulled the flare out and struck the cap to ignite the bright red flame that hissed loudly in the silence. He threw the burning flare as hard as he could toward the tree line where the two men were advancing. The bright light blinded them for a moment and created a long shadow that danced wildly on the snow. Silas used that split second of confusion to sprint across the open ice toward the driver's side of his truck. He heard another shot ring out and felt the wind of the bullet passing inches from his ear. He reached the truck and grabbed the handle to pull himself up into the cab with a desperate burst of strength. He slammed the door shut and locked it just as a heavy impact shook the entire vehicle frame. One of the attackers had reached the truck and was banging the butt of his rifle against the door. Silas fumbled for his keys, which he had dropped on the floorboard in his panic to get inside. He found them and jammed the key into the ignition, turning it with a prayer on his lips. The diesel engine roared to life with a thunderous sound that vibrated through the metal of the cab. The attacker outside shattered the side window with his rifle butt and reached in to grab Silas by the jacket. Silas grabbed the fire extinguisher he kept mounted by the seat and sprayed the chemical powder directly into the man's face. The man screamed and fell back off the step, clutching his eyes and coughing violently from the chemical cloud. Silas shifted the truck into reverse and slammed his foot down on the accelerator pedal to move the rig. The heavy wheels spun on the ice for an agonizing second before finding traction on the gravel beneath. The truck lurched backward and the trailer swung wildly as he tried to back away from the blockade. He saw the other two men running into the road and raising their weapons to fire at the windshield. Silas ducked below the dashboard and steered blindly using his memory of the road behind him. The windshield shattered above him as bullets peppered the glass and filled the cab with cold air and snow. He continued to reverse for what felt like a mile until he found a spot wide enough to turn around. He performed a dangerous three-point turn on the narrow cliff road with the rear tires hanging over the edge. He shifted into a forward gear and drove back down the mountain at a speed that was reckless and terrifying. He did not stop driving until he reached the lights of the main highway town 20 miles away. He pulled the damaged truck directly to the police station and ran inside shouting for help and protection. The officers were shocked to see the state of the truck and the shattered windshield covered in snow. Silas told them the entire story about the old man and the blockade and the men in white camouflage. The police chief listened with a grim expression and told Silas that he was the first person to return. They had received reports of missing travelers in that area for years, but never had a witness or a location. A massive tactical team was assembled and sent up the mountain road with snowcats and armored vehicles. They found the abandoned sedan and the other buried cars just as Silas had described them to the officers. They also found a hidden cabin deep in the woods that was filled with the stolen cargo from dozens of trucks. The cabin was empty of people, but the stove was still warm, which meant the gang had fled just minutes before. The police found a sophisticated radio system that the gang used to monitor police frequencies and truck channels. They realized the old man at the diner was a spotter who identified vulnerable targets for the hijackers. The police raided the diner later that night and arrested the old man who was sitting at the same counter. He admitted to sending dozens of drivers to the road over the last 10 years in exchange for a cut. The gang was eventually tracked down to a remote hunting lodge near the Canadian border weeks later. A firefight ensued, and the leaders of the highway pirate ring were either killed or captured by the federal agents. The investigation revealed that they had made millions of dollars stealing cargo and stripping cars for parts in the winter. They relied on the snow to hide their crimes and the isolation to keep their victims silent. The twist that haunted Silas for the rest of his life was found in the trunk of the abandoned sedan. The police found a woman bound and gagged inside the trunk who was still alive but suffering from hypothermia. She had been the driver of the car and had been used as bait to make the scene look like an accident. If Silas had not stopped to check the car, she would have frozen to death in that trunk that night. He realized that his decision to stop had saved a life, even though it almost cost him his own. The road was officially closed permanently by the state, and huge concrete barriers were placed at the entrance. Silas continued to drive trucks for another 5 years, but he never took a secondary road again. He stuck to the main interstates and always parked in well-lit areas with other drivers around. He kept the tire iron on his passenger seat as a reminder of the night he fought the highway ghosts. The story of the road became a legend among truckers who shared it over radios late at night. They called it the road that vanishes because it does not appear on any modern map or GPS system. The physical road is still there under the snow and the trees that are slowly reclaiming the pavement. The button of the story is a somber reflection on the trust we place in strangers on the road. The friendly advice from a local can sometimes be a lure into a trap that has no exit. The winter landscape is beautiful, but it is also a curtain that can hide terrible things from view. The isolation of the highway is a freedom for some, but a weapon for others who wait in the dark. Silas learned that the most dangerous part of the job was not the ice or the mechanical failures. It was the human element that could turn a routine delivery into a fight for survival. The wind still howls through that valley and covers the rusted remains of the cars that were never recovered. The snow falls every year and buries the secrets of the highway pirates deeper into the earth. Travelers who pass by the concrete barriers often wonder what lies down that dark and overgrown path. They do not know that it is a monument to the greed and violence that once ruled the mountain pass. It stands as a silent warning to anyone who thinks about taking a shortcut through the unknown. The road may be closed, but the memory of the horror remains fresh for those who survived it. Silas eventually retired and moved to a warm state in the south, where it never snows. He enjoys the sunshine and the flat roads that stretch out to the horizon without a single tree. But every now and then, when the air conditioning blows cold, he remembers the feeling of the freezing wind. He remembers the white camouflage and the sound of the bullet shattering the glass of the window. And he remembers the empty eyes of the old man who smiled and sent him into the trap. It is a memory that will never melt away, no matter how hot the summer sun gets. The highway is a lifeline that connects the country, but it is also a fragile thread. When the weather turns and the lights go out, the rules of civilization can disappear in an instant. We are all just one wrong turn away from finding ourselves on a road that should not exist. The safety we feel in our vehicles is an illusion that can be shattered by a single fallen tree. The story of Silas is a testament to the instinct to survive that lives inside every one of us, and it is a reminder to always check your map and never trust a shortcut in the snow. The final report on the case was filed away in a dusty box in the basement of the police station. It contains the photos of the cars and the cabin and the confession of the old man. But the true horror of the event cannot be captured in a police file or a court transcript. It lives in the quiet moments when you are driving alone at night and the signal fades. It lives in the shadow that moves in the corner of your eye when you stop to check a tire. And it lives in the realization that the road ahead is dark and you are completely alone. In this new story, the baby monitor recorded a voice that knew everyone's name. The security of a modern nursery is often entrusted to digital monitoring systems that provide parents with a constant audio and visual connection to their children. Most people believe that these devices are secure portals that only allow authorized users to listen in on the quiet sounds of a sleeping infant. However, the internal server logs and archived audio files from a suburban home in Northern Virginia suggest that some signals are not as private as they seem. A routine evening of monitoring can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when the device begins to broadcast information it should not know. Kellen Thorne was a 36-year-old cybersecurity consultant who spent his professional hours identifying critical vulnerabilities in the networks of major financial institutions. He lived in a newly constructed smart home with his wife and their 10-month-old daughter in a quiet residential neighborhood. His primary goal for the weekend in the year 2024 was to finalize a security audit for a local data center project. Kellen was a man who understood the risks of connected technology and had implemented advanced encryption protocols on every device in his household. He took great pride in the fact that his family lived in what he considered a digital fortress against any external threats. The incident began on a humid Saturday night in the month of August in the year 2024 while a light rain fell outside. Kellen was sitting in the living room with the baby monitor tablet active on the coffee table while his daughter slept upstairs. He checked the digital display and noticed that the audio levels were spiking even though the nursery remained perfectly still and quiet. Suddenly, a soft and melodic voice began to emerge from the speaker of the monitor that did not belong to his wife. He froze when the voice clearly whispered the full legal name of his daughter, followed by a very specific and personal. The voice continued to speak and accurately identified Kellen and his wife by their first names, despite them never being programmed into device. Kellen felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the monitor was recording a voice that seemed to have intimate knowledge of his. He immediately grabbed his laptop to check the network traffic logs to see if an unauthorized user had breached his secure home. The logs indicated that no external IP addresses were connected to the monitor, and the encryption remained fully intact during the event. He ran upstairs to the nursery and found his daughter sleeping soundly while the voice continued to hum a familiar lullaby. The next morning, Kellen began a step-by-step investigation of the hardware by reviewing the manufacturer diagnostic logs and the local storage. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every software update and patch he had applied to the smart home system. He discovered that the monitor had been capturing and storing small fragments of ambient conversation from the living room for several months. The logs revealed that the internal artificial intelligence of the camera was attempting to categorize every distinct voice it heard in the. According to the archived system notes, the device was programmed to recognize names, to provide a more personalized user experience for parents. He searched the digital archives of the cloud server and found a series of recordings that were labeled as unrecognized background noise events. Kellen played the files and heard the same melodic voice repeating the names of his extended family members who had visited recently. He found a hidden directory in the firmware that contained a detailed profile of his family that the device had built itself. The profile included birthdays and professional titles, and even the names of their childhood pets that were mentioned in casual kitchen conversations. According to the state records from the year 2023, the company had faced several inquiries regarding data privacy, and Kellen decided to conduct a physical inspection of the nursery to see if the device was picking up signals from a neighbor. He used a high-frequency signal detector and found a strange resonance coming from a vintage music box that sat on the. The music box was a family heirloom that had been passed down through several generations, and it sat directly next to the. He realized that the metallic vibrations from the old gears were interfering with the sensitive microphone of the modern digital baby monitor. The voice he heard was actually a distorted playback of his own wife speaking in the kitchen months ago during a holiday. The sophisticated software in the monitor had taken those distorted audio fragments and attempted to reconstruct them into a coherent and recognizable. It had used the names it learned from previous recordings to fill in the gaps of the low-quality audio signal. Kellen realized that the voice was not an intruder or a ghost, but a product of an overactive and glitching machine. The AI had essentially created a composite voice that knew everything about his family because it had been listening to them constantly. He felt a sense of relief, but also a deep concern for the invasive nature of the technology he had trusted. He immediately disconnected the smart monitor and replaced it with a simple analog device that did not have any internal data storage. Kellen updated his security blog to warn other parents about the potential for smart devices to create their own digital haunting events. He shared his findings with the manufacturer, who reportedly opened an internal investigation into the autonomous behavior of their voice recognition software. The house returned to its normal state of privacy, and the nursery remained quiet for the rest of the long summer. He understood that even the most secure fortress has vulnerabilities that are built into the very code of the modern world. The nursery is quiet now, and the digital logs no longer record any unauthorized voices or personal details about the Thorne family. Kellen still monitors his network with a critical eye, but he no longer trusts the convenience of artificial intelligence in his eye. He knows that the data we provide to our devices can be used in ways that we never intended or fully. The incident remains a cautionary tale in the cybersecurity community about the hidden costs of a truly connected and smart home today. He sleeps soundly, knowing that the only voices in his house are the ones that are physically present in the room. Some memories are meant to stay private, and some voices are never meant to be recorded by a machine in the Roloningay. In this news story, he locked his bedroom door before sleeping. The footage made no sense. The concept of a locked door represents the ultimate physical boundary between the safety of a home and the unknown outside world. Most people assume that a heavy deadbolt and a closed window provide an absolute guarantee of privacy during the quiet night hours. However, the digital logs and recovered video files from a residence in suburban Ohio suggest that some barriers are entirely useless. A routine evening of rest can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when the final footage reveals an impossible event. Leland Thorne was a 46-year-old hardware engineer who spent his days designing high-security storage for massive data centers. He lived alone in a modern ranch-style house that he had recently equipped with a complex motion tracking camera system. His primary goal for the month of November in the year 2024 was to secure his private property. Leland was a man of cold logic who did not believe in anything that could not be caught on camera. He followed a strict nightly routine of locking every exterior entrance before retreating to his primary bedroom for the night. The incident began on a rainy Tuesday in the month of November in the year 2024 during a storm. Leland completed his rounds and confirmed that the bedroom door was physically locked from the inside with a heavy deadbolt. He fell into a deep sleep until he was startled awake by a sudden and very sharp drop in temperature. He checked the digital clock on his nightstand and saw it was exactly 3:42 in the early morning. He noticed that his bedroom door was standing wide open to the dark hallway, despite the bolt still being extended. He grabbed his tablet with shaking hands to review the live motion tracking footage that was stored on his local server. The recording showed Leland lying perfectly still in his bed, while the door remained firmly shut for several quiet hours. At precisely 3:41 in the morning, the heavy wooden door began to turn translucent in the high-definition footage. It appeared to lose its physical density as a dark and very tall figure stepped through the solid wood surface. The figure did not use the handle or pick the lock, but simply passed through the barrier like a shadow. Leland began a step-by-step investigation of the hardware by reviewing the manufacturer diagnostic logs and the local server. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every software update and patch he had applied to the system. He discovered that the camera had not malfunctioned, but had captured a massive surge in local electromagnetic field activity. The logs revealed that the internal clock of the security hub had skipped forward by exactly 60 seconds during the event. According to the archive notes from the state records, the house sat on a site used for radio experiments. He searched the digital archives of the county file and found a series of recordings from 1978. These files described a scientist named Silas Vance, who had been obsessed with the concept of phase-shifting physical matter. Silas had reportedly disappeared from the property during a massive electrical surge that occurred exactly 50 years before this event. The witness statements from the original investigation mentioned that the doors in the house would often open by themselves. Leland realized that the figure on the footage was not a person, but a lingering echo of an experiment. The footage made no sense to the local authorities who reviewed the files, but could find no evidence of a break-in. Investigators never confirmed the presence of an intruder, and the state records conflict regarding the safety of the land. Leland decided to move out of the house, and he took the security hardware with him to a new location. He kept the original video files on a secure drive as a record of the night the door failed. He understands now that some boundaries are not physical, and some secrets are buried deep within the earth itself. The house remains empty today as the local utility companies continue to monitor the area for unusual power fluctuations and surges. Leland still reviews the footage occasionally, but he remains unable to find a mechanical flaw in the door or the lock. The final footage is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies all modern engineering. He sleeps with a heavy flashlight nearby now because he knows that even the strongest locks cannot stop the past. Some properties carry a memory that is etched into the very soil and the air of the surrounding landscape. Leland Thorne eventually sold the ranch-style house to a development firm that intended to demolish the structure for new units. The demolition crews reportedly experienced several delays due to equipment failures and unexplainable power outages at the site. Some workers claimed to hear the sound of a heavy deadbolt clicking into place even when no doors were standing. These reports were never officially verified by the project manager, but they added to the local mystery of the property. The state records from 2024 remain the only official documentation of the strange activity at the site. The engineering community still discusses the Leland Thorne footage as an example of a potential glitch in modern sensor technology. However, Leland knows that what he saw was not a digital error, but a physical breach of his reality. He spends his time now researching the intersection of electromagnetic fields and the preservation of human consciousness in architecture. The ranch house is gone, but the data Leland collected serves as a haunting reminder of the night he was vulnerable. He lives in a high-rise apartment now where the walls are thick and the locks are entirely electronic. Leland occasionally receives emails from other homeowners who have experienced similar anomalies with their own high-end security systems. Each story is different, but they all share the same sense of helplessness when a physical barrier is simply ignored. He has built a private network to share these logs and investigate the patterns of these recurring temporal events. The goal is to understand if these echoes are localized or if they are a part of a larger phenomenon. For Leland, the quest for the truth is the only way to regain the sense of control he lost. The final report on the property noted that the soil contained traces of rare minerals that could conduct high voltage. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the electromagnetic surges that Silas Vance had originally sought to harness. It suggests that the house was accidentally built on top of a natural conductor that amplified the experimental energy. Leland believes that the figure he saw was Silas himself, finally breaking through the barrier he had spent years studying. The locked door was not a challenge to him, but merely a thin veil in a much larger world. The quiet suburbs of Ohio rarely make the national news for anything other than routine events and local weather reports. Yet underneath the surface of the manicured lawns and identical houses, there are stories that remain hidden from the light. Leland Thorne is one of the few who has a digital record of the impossible hidden on a secure drive. He continues to sleep with the lights on because the darkness holds too many memories of the open door. The truth is often more unsettling than any fiction because it leaves us with no way to protect ourselves. The demolition of the ranch house was completed in the winter of 2025, and the site is now flat. No new construction has started as the development firm wait for the results of a final environmental safety study. The memory of the figure in the footage remains the only proof that something extraordinary occurred in that quiet room. Leland has moved on with his life, but he never forgets to check the logs every single morning. He knows that the past is never truly gone, and it is always looking for a way to return. The legacy of Silas Vance is now a part of the local lore that the younger residents discuss on social media. They talk about the man who stepped through walls and the engineer who captured it all on a tablet. For Leland, it is not a story for entertainment, but a factual record of a night that changed his life. He continues to design his hardware with a new perspective on the true meaning of a secure boundary. The locks are only the beginning of the defense against a world that we do not fully understand yet. In this new story, at 3:19 a.m., someone knocked on the bedroom wall from the inside. The structural integrity of a modern home is usually defined by the solid boundaries between the living spaces and the hollow voids within the walls. Most homeowners assume that the sounds they hear at night are just the house settling or the wind moving through the attic vents. However, the maintenance logs and acoustic recordings from a specific residence in rural Oregon suggest that some noises have a far more deliberate source. A quiet night in the suburbs can quickly turn into an investigation of things that should not exist behind the plaster and lath. Sterling Vance was a 44-year-old industrial architect who spent his days designing highly efficient layouts for massive distribution centers. He lived in a restored Victorian-era house that sat on a large wooded lot on the outskirts of a small mountain town. His primary goal for the year 2024 was to finish a series of complex blueprints for a new sustainable housing project. Sterling was a man of extreme logic and precision who did not believe in anything that could not be measured or mapped. He shared the large house with his wife and their young son, who both slept soundly through the quiet night hours. The incident began on a humid Tuesday in the month of August in the year 2024, during a localized thunderstorm. Sterling was working late in his home office when he heard a sharp and rhythmic thud coming from the bedroom hallway. He checked the digital clock on his desk and saw it was exactly 3:19 in the morning, which was very strange. He walked into the master bedroom where his wife was sleeping, and he stopped when he heard the sound again. It was a distinct knocking pattern that originated from deep within the shared wall between the bedroom and the master bathroom. The knocking was firm and intentional, as if someone was using a heavy knuckle to strike the wooden studs from the inside. Sterling felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the sound was coming from a space that had no physical access points. He used a professional-grade stud finder to scan the wall and found that the cavity was completely empty of pipes. There was no electrical wiring running through that specific section of the wall, which made the source of the noise even more. He stayed awake for the rest of the night and listened as the knocking continued at regular intervals until the sun rose. The next morning, Sterling began a step-by-step investigation of the house structure by reviewing the original architectural blueprints from archives. He was a meticulous man who kept detailed digital files of every renovation that had been performed on the property since 19. He discovered that the house had undergone a major structural change in the year 1955 following a small kitchen fire. The contractors at the time had sealed off a narrow service corridor that once ran between the main bedrooms and the plumbing. According to the archive notes from the state records, the corridor was used by staff to access the laundry chutes quickly. He searched the attic and the crawl space under the floorboards to find an entrance to this forgotten and sealed-off vertical space. He found a small access hatch hidden behind a heavy built-in bookshelf in the guest room that he had ignored. Sterling used a pry bar to open the hatch, and he was met with a cloud of gray dust and cold. He shone his powerful flashlight into the void and saw a narrow ladder leading down into the darkness between the bedroom walls. The air smelled of old paper and damp earth, which indicated that the space had not been ventilated for many decades. He climbed down the ladder and found a small wooden chair tucked into a corner that was only 2 feet wide. On the floor sat a collection of old rusted tins and a series of handwritten notes that were dated 1950. The notes were written by a man named Elias Thorne, who had worked as a maintenance man for the previous owners. Elias reportedly suffered from a severe sleep disorder and had created the hidden room as a place to find total silence. According to the county file from 2009, Elias had disappeared from the property without leaving any trace of his. Sterling noticed a series of tally marks carved into the wooden studs that matched the exact rhythm of the knocking he heard. The marks were grouped into sets of 3, which was the same pattern that had woken him up at 3:19. He realized that the knocking was not a haunting, but a mechanical echo caused by a weighted pendulum Elias had built. The device was designed to tap on the wall at a specific frequency to help the man fall into a deep. Over the years, the house had shifted and the pendulum had become stuck until the recent storm loosened the old mechanism. He decided to dismantle the old wooden device and seal the access hatch permanently to ensure the safety of his family. Sterling felt a sense of relief as he understood the logical cause of the mystery that had disturbed his quiet night. He updated his own home maintenance logs to include the discovery of the hidden service corridor for any future property owners. The knocking stopped completely, and the house returned to its normal state of peaceful silence for the rest of the season. He kept the handwritten notes in his office as a reminder of the man who sought silence in the walls. The house remains quiet now, and the digital logs no longer record any unusual acoustic spikes during the early morning hours. Sterling still checks the blueprints occasionally, but he knows that the boundaries of his home are now fully mapped and secure. He understands that some secrets are just forgotten pieces of engineering that are waiting to be found by the right person. The past has a way of leaving a physical mark on a house that survives through every new renovation and owner. He sleeps soundly, knowing that the only sounds he hears are the normal and predictable movements of a safe family. Every building tells a story, if we are willing to look behind the plaster and listen to the echoes of construction. Sterling Vance continues to design his efficient layouts, but he now pays closer attention to the empty spaces in between the walls. He knows that the logic of architecture can often hide the small and human details of those who lived there before. The town remains peaceful, and the Victorian house stands as a silent witness to the history of those who saw it. He closes his laptop and turns off the office light with a sense of total and complete architectural clarity tonight. The investigation concluded that no physical intruder had ever been present within the walls of the Sterling residence during the incident. Local investigators never confirmed the claims of previous tenants, who spoke of strange movements in the hallways during the winter months. Records conflict regarding the final fate of Elias Thorne, but the notes he left behind remain a tangible piece of evidence. Sterling often wonders how many other homes have hidden corridors that have been lost to time and forgotten by the living. He values the silence of his home more than ever now that he knows exactly what lies within the structure. The mystery was solved by a man of logic who refused to accept anything less than the physical truth today. In this news story, every night, the same figure stood at the foot of the bed until it moved. The psychological boundary between sleep and wakefulness is often a vulnerable state where the brain struggles to process external stimuli correctly. Most people assume that waking up to a dark room means they're alone with their thoughts and the familiar shadows of their furniture. However, the sleep study data and digital logs from a suburban home in northern Georgia suggest that some observations are far more consistent. A routine evening of rest can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when a recurring visual anomaly is documented by external sensors. Elias Vance was a 39-year-old sleep researcher who spent his professional hours analyzing the neurological patterns of patients with chronic insomnia. He lived in a modern townhouse on the outskirts of Atlanta that he had equipped with infrared cameras and biometric sensors. His primary goal for the year 2024 was to document his own sleep cycles to better understand the impact of high-stress environments. Elias was a man of cold logic who didn't believe in anything that couldn't be quantified by a dataset or a digital recording. He followed a strict nightly routine of calibrating his equipment before lying down in his primary bedroom for the night. The incident began on a rainy Tuesday in the month of November in the year 2024 during a localized thunderstorm. Elias woke up at exactly 3:12 in the morning and felt a heavy pressure sitting on his chest as he looked toward the foot of his bed. He clearly saw a dark and motionless figure standing near the wooden frame of the mattress in the dim light. He assumed it was a standard episode of sleep paralysis and waited for his motor functions to return so he could turn on the light. The figure remained perfectly still for exactly 5 minutes before it suddenly shifted its weight and stepped toward the bedroom door. He grabbed his tablet with shaking hands the next morning to review the high-definition infrared footage that was stored on his local server. The recording showed Elias lying perfectly still while a distinct heat signature manifested at the foot of his bed at 3:12. It appeared to have the physical proportions of a tall adult male, but the thermal imaging showed no internal core temperature. The signature remained static until 3:17, when it moved toward the hallway with a fluid and very deliberate gait. He checked the biometric logs and found that his own heart rate had remained steady during the entire duration of the event. Elias began a step-by-step investigation of the house structure by reviewing the county file from 2009 regarding the property's history. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every software update and patch he had applied to his research system. He discovered that the townhouse was built on a site that reportedly housed a private medical clinic during the year 1940. The archives indicated that the clinic specialized in early experiments regarding the use of electromagnetic fields to treat mental health disorders. According to the archive notes from the state records, one patient had disappeared during a high-voltage trial in 1941. He searched the digital archives of the local historical society and found a series of recordings from the original construction of the residential neighborhood. These files described a man named Silas Thorne who had worked as a night watchman for the clinic during the mid-20th century. Silas had reportedly suffered from a chronic heart condition and was known for standing perfectly still for long periods to catch his breath. The witness statements from the original investigation mentioned that Silas was often seen patrolling the exact area where the master bedroom was now. Elias realized that the figure on the footage matched the historical descriptions of the watchman who had died on the site. The footage made no sense to the local investigators who reviewed the files, but could find no evidence of a physical break-in. Some locals claimed that the property was prone to unusual electrical interference that could cause cameras to record phantom images and artifacts. Investigators never confirmed the presence of an intruder, and the state records conflict regarding the safety of the original clinic site. Elias decided to keep the infrared cameras active and continued to document the nightly appearance of the static figure. He kept the original video files on a secure drive as a record of the consistent and predictable nature of the anomaly. The figure appeared at the foot of the bed every night, at exactly 3:12 for the next 3 months without any deviation. Elias noticed that the heat signature was slowly becoming more defined in the high-definition recordings as the winter months progressed. The biometric logs eventually began to capture a secondary rhythmic pulse that did not belong to Elias or any known biological source. According to the archive notes, the original clinic had used a specific frequency that was known to resonate with the human heart. He realized that the figure was a localized energy pattern that had become permanently etched into the structural foundation of the room. He decided to install a series of copper grounding rods around the perimeter of the master bedroom to neutralize any lingering electromagnetic fields. Elias felt a sense of professional curiosity as he watched the figure gradually fade in the subsequent nightly recordings over the next week. The movement toward the door became less deliberate, and the heat signature eventually lost its human proportions and became a faint blur. He updated his research logs to include the discovery of the structural resonance for any future scientific inquiries into the phenomenon. The sighting stopped completely by the end of February, and the room returned to its normal state of quiet darkness. The townhouse remains occupied today as Elias continues his sleep research with a new focus on the environmental factors of nocturnal hallucinations. He still reviews the original footage occasionally, but he remains unable to find a software flaw in the infrared sensors or the server. The final footage is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple medical explanation. He sleeps without the biometric sensors now because he knows that some boundaries are not defined by the skin, but by the air. Some properties carry a memory that is recorded in the very atoms of the building and the surrounding landscape. The engineering community still discusses the Elias Vance logs as an example of potential interference in high-sensitivity medical-grade monitoring equipment. However, Elias knows that what he saw was not a digital error, but a factual record of a past presence. He spends his time now researching the intersection of historical architecture and the preservation of energy in modern residential zones. The townhouse stands as a silent witness to the man who stood watch long after his shift was officially over. He closes his research journal and turns off the monitor with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity tonight. The final report on the property noted that the grounding rods had successfully eliminated a significant amount of static electricity from the floorboards. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the visual anomalies that Elias had originally sought to quantify with his sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a natural battery for the experimental energy that had been released decades ago. Elias believes that the figure was Silas himself, finally completing his rounds and moving on from the station he had guarded. The foot of the bed was merely a waypoint in a much larger and more complex journey through time. The quiet suburbs of Georgia rarely make the national news for anything other than routine community events and local sports scores. Yet underneath the surface of the identical townhouses and paved streets, there are stories that remain recorded in the local archives. Elias Vance is one of the few who has a digital record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure drive. He continues to sleep soundly because the darkness is now a place of rest rather than a place of observation. The truth is often more complex than we assume because it requires us to look at the data without any bias. The study of the structural resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were published anonymously. No further incidents have been reported by the neighbors as the grounding system continues to function perfectly within the walls of the pond. The memory of the figure in the footage remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that quiet room. Elias has moved on with his career, but he never forgets to check the signal levels every single morning. He knows that the past is always looking for a way to be heard by the technology of the future. The legacy of the night watchman is now a part of the local history that the research team discusses in their private meetings. They talk about the man who stood still and the researcher who captured the heat of a ghost on a tablet. For Elias, it isn't a story for a campfire, but a technical record of a night that changed his understanding. He continues to design his experiments with a new perspective on the true meaning of a secure and quiet environment. The sensors are only the beginning of the observation of a world that we're still learning to measure properly. In this new story, at exactly midnight, the bedroom light turned on, no one was home. The reliability of modern home automation systems is often marketed as a foolproof method for maintaining a lived-in appearance while a property is unoccupied. Most homeowners assume that a digital schedule managed via a centralized hub will execute lighting commands with perfect mechanical precision. However, the internal server logs and electrical frequency records from a high-tech residence in suburban Arizona suggest that some activations occur outside the programmed parameters. A routine vacation can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when a remote monitoring app alerts the owner to a physical change in an empty house. Kellen Sterling was a 42-year-old electrical engineer who specialized in smart grid integration for large-scale utility companies in the Phoenix area. He lived in a custom-built, energy-efficient home in the foothills of the McDowell Mountains that he'd outfitted with a proprietary, hardwired automation network. His primary goal for the winter of 2024 was to take a 10-day solo hiking trip through the Grand Canyon while monitoring his home's performance via a secure satellite uplink. Kellen was a man of extreme technical discipline who'd programmed every light, lock, and sensor to follow a strict, randomized schedule to deter any potential burglars. He relied on real-time data and encrypted notifications to maintain a sense of total control over his property from hundreds of miles away. The incident began on a clear Tuesday in the month of November in the year 2024 during a period of intense desert cooling. Kellen was at his campsite when his smartphone received a high-priority notification, indicating that the primary bedroom light had been manually switched on at precisely midnight. He opened his home security app and felt a surge of cold adrenaline as the live interior camera feed showed the room flooded with a bright, steady light. The motion sensors remained inactive, and the smart locks confirmed that no doors or windows had been opened or tampered with since his departure. He zoomed in on the physical wall switch and noticed that the toggle was in the up position, despite the fact that he lived alone and the house was completely empty. The light remained on for exactly 60 minutes before it clicked back into the off position at precisely 1 o'clock in the morning. Kellen used his remote access to pull the electrical consumption logs and found a massive, localized power surge that had occurred at the exact moment of the activation. He checked the diagnostic history of the smart hub and discovered that the system had recorded no command, digital or manual, to trigger the bedroom circuit. The footage from the previous 6 hours showed the room in total darkness, with no shadows or movement that would suggest a physical intruder was present. He stayed awake in his tent, repeatedly refreshing the camera feed, but the room remained silent and dark for the rest of the night. The next morning, Kellen began a step-by-step investigation of his home's network by reviewing the manufacturer's firmware logs and the archived notes from the original electrical contractor. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every circuit load and signal interference pattern that had occurred since the house was built in 2015. He discovered that the master bedroom was situated directly above a decommissioned utility vault that had been sealed during the early 1990s. According to a county file from 2009, the vault had housed a series of experimental high-voltage transformers used for testing regional power grid resilience. The archives indicated that a senior technician had died from an accidental discharge at that exact location during a midnight maintenance check in 1992. He searched the digital archives of the local utility company and found a series of recordings from the original site supervisors regarding unexplainable phantom loads on the circuit. These files described a man named Silas Thorne, who was known for his obsessive punctuality and his habit of manually testing switches at the top of every hour. Silas had reportedly been found slumped against the primary control panel, his hand still gripping the main toggle that managed the lighting for the facility's upper level. The witness statements from the original state records mentioned that the vault continued to hum with residual energy for years after the power was officially cut. Kellen realized that the structural alignment of his bedroom floor and the vault's ceiling created a perfect path for electromagnetic induction. The high-definition footage was reviewed by a systems analyst who found that the light didn't just turn on, but appeared to reach full intensity instantly, bypassing the smart dimmer's soft start feature. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a physical intruder on the property, as the exterior perimeter sensors showed no disturbances in the gravel landscaping. Records conflict regarding the exact nature of the midnight surge, with some engineers claiming it was a static discharge event caused by the dry desert air and the proximity to the old vault. Kellen decided to install a series of heavy-duty grounding plates beneath his bedroom floorboards and continued to monitor the midnight logs for any signs of recurring activity. He kept the original 1-hour recording on a secure, encrypted drive as a record of the night that his smart home was overridden by a legacy signal. The property remains under constant observation today as Kellen continues his work with a new focus on the lingering electrical echoes of decommissioned industrial sites. He still reviews the midnight footage occasionally, but he remains unable to find a software glitch or a mechanical failure in the smart switch or the hub. The final report is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple technical explanation in the age of digital automation. He sleeps with a manual override switch now because he knows that some circuits don't need a user ID to be activated by the past. Some locations carry an electrical memory that is recorded in the very wiring of the walls and the surrounding earth. The engineering community still discusses the Kellen Sterling incident as an example of potential ghost switching in high-density residential zones built over industrial infrastructure. However, Kellen knows that what his sensors captured was not a hardware error, but a factual record of a routine that was older than his house. He spends his time now researching the intersection of historical power grids and the modern smart devices that are built on top of the forgotten vaults of the past. The house stands as a silent witness to the technician who was still trying to complete his midnight rounds decades after the facility was closed. He closes his laptop and turns off the office light with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the signals in the dark. The final entry in the county file regarding the death of the technician noted that he was a man of immense technical pride and a terrifyingly focused sense of responsibility. This detail suggests that the presence Kellen detected was not a malicious hack, but an echo of an obligation that had been repeated for a lifetime. It suggests that the bedroom floor was acting as a storage medium for the final mechanical actions of a man who refused to leave his post during the blackout. Kellen believes that the midnight surge was a bridge between the old grid and the new that allowed a forgotten duty to be seen one last time. The light in the bedroom was merely a reminder that the energy we put into our work can linger long after the switch has been turned off. The quiet foothills of Arizona rarely make the national news for anything other than routine property development reports and standard seasonal tourism updates. Yet, underneath the surface of the modern desert homes, there are stories that remain recorded in the deep, unindexed layers of the local utility archives. Kellen Sterling is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive for future study. He continues to document every voltage spike with the same professional objectivity because he knows that the truth is often found in the things that shouldn't have power. The reality of the midnight light is a mystery that requires us to acknowledge the things that we cannot simply explain away with a remote reset. The study of the property's electromagnetic and grounding resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under restricted access. No further midnight activations have been reported by Kellen, as the home's grounding system was updated to isolate the bedroom circuit from the vault below. The memory of the light turning on in an empty house remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that desert sanctuary. Kellen has moved on with his career, but he never forgets to check the midnight logs every single morning when he first logs into his server. He knows that the past is always looking for a way to leave a digital signature on the technology and the lives of the future. The legacy of the technician is now a part of the local lore that the electrical workers discuss in their private radio channels during the long night shifts. They talk about the man who died at his post and the engineer who found the pulse of a ghost on his monitoring tablet. For Kellen, it isn't a story for a dinner party, but a technical record of a night that changed his understanding of what it means to be truly secure. He continues to design his smart grid protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a reliable and private environment for his family. The hubs are only the beginning of the observation of a world that we're still learning to measure in the darkness. The final report on the property noted that the vault had experienced a localized phenomenon known as resonant coupling due to the unique layout of the bedroom's copper wiring. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the electrical anomalies that Kellen had originally sought to quantify with his professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a natural antenna for the static charge of the Earth and the forgotten transformers that once stood in the valley below. Kellen looks at the mountain ridge and wonders how many other people are being signaled by the stories of those who built the frontier's power. He understands now that the most important data is often the kind that requires a midnight watch to even believe. The house remains a dark silhouette against the Arizona skyline while the engineer continues to search for the patterns in the encrypted logs. Kellen Sterling keeps his focus on the grid, but he's always watching for the light of a man who doesn't belong to the living world anymore. He knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right moment to be seen by an objective and technical observer. The silence of the desert is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everything that happened before he arrived. He sleeps soundly now, knowing that the watchman has finally been documented and found his way back into the digital archives of the past. In this new story, the security camera caught someone watching the house for 6 hours straight. The sense of security provided by high-definition residential surveillance systems is often based on the assumption that the cameras act as a deterrent to any outside observation. Most homeowners expect that a quick check of their mobile alerts will reveal nothing more than a delivery person or a stray animal passing through the frame. However, the forensic server logs and archived video files from a secluded property in northern Idaho suggest that some observers aren't looking for an entry point, but are simply content to stay perfectly still. A routine security audit can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when a homeowner realizes that a silent figure has been part of the landscape for the entire duration of the night. Leland Thorne was a 45-year-old systems architect who worked remotely for a global cybersecurity firm specializing in encrypted cloud storage. He lived alone in a modern, glass-fronted cabin situated on a rugged ridge overlooking the Coeur d'Alene National Forest. His primary goal for the winter of 2024 was to finalize a series of high-level security patches while enjoying the isolation of the mountain terrain. Leland was a man of extreme technical precision who'd installed a military-grade thermal imaging network around his property to ensure he was never caught off guard. He relied on real-time data and infrared sensors to maintain a perimeter that he believed was virtually impenetrable to any unauthorized presence. The incident began on a freezing Tuesday in the month of November in the year 2024 during a period of heavy, blinding snowfall. Leland was finishing a late-night coding session at approximately 4 in the morning when he decided to run a diagnostic check on his exterior camera array. He opened the history logs and noticed a single persistent heat signature that had triggered the motion sensors at precisely 10 o'clock the previous evening. He scrolled back through the footage and felt a surge of cold adrenaline as he realized the figure had not moved a single inch for 6 hours. The thermal feed showed a tall, human-shaped mass standing directly at the edge of the tree line, its heat signature a steady, low-contrast blur against the frozen backdrop. The figure remained in a fixed, upright position, facing the large, floor-to-ceiling windows of Leland's home office with a chilling level of focus. Leland used the digital zoom on his 48-megapixel camera, but the falling snow and the low-light conditions obscured any identifiable facial features or clothing. He checked the biometric security logs for his smart locks and confirmed that no physical breach of the house had been attempted during the duration of the observation. The footage showed the figure standing motionless through the peak of the storm, seemingly unaffected by the sub-zero temperatures or the high mountain winds. He stayed at his desk, watching the live feed in total silence, until the sun finally began to crest over the eastern peaks. The next morning, Leland began a step-by-step investigation of the perimeter by reviewing the local server records and the archived notes from the original land survey. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every environmental sensor spike and network ping that occurred on his private grid. He discovered that the area where the figure stood was a rocky outcrop that had once housed a makeshift observation post during the early 1950s. According to a county file from 2009, the site had been used by a local fire warden who was reportedly obsessed with monitoring the valley for unauthorized activity. The archives indicated that the warden had disappeared from his post during a record-breaking blizzard in 1956 and was never located by search teams. He searched the digital archives of the local historical society and found a series of recordings from the original developers who'd attempted to build on the ridge decades ago. These files described a man named Silas Vance, who was known for his habit of standing on the ridge for hours, even after his official shift had ended. Silas had reportedly believed that the forest held secrets that could only be seen by those who remained perfectly still for long periods of time. The witness statements from the original state records mention that the warden was often mistaken for a weathered tree stump by hikers who passed through the area. Leland realized that the coordinates of the thermal signature matched the exact location where the warden's old chair had been found. The high-definition footage was reviewed by a forensic video analyst who found that the figure appeared to lose its physical definition during the highest peaks of the storm. Investigators never confirmed the presence of an intruder on the property, as the fresh snow on the ridge showed no footprints or disturbances in the morning. Records conflict regarding the exact nature of the thermal signature, with some technicians claiming it was a localized ghost image caused by sensor ghosting in extreme cold. Leland decided to keep his infrared array active and continued to monitor the ridge every night for any signs of the Silent Watcher's return. He kept the original 6-hour recording on a secure, encrypted drive as a record of the night that his isolation was shared by something unseen. The property remains under heavy surveillance today as Leland continues his work with a new focus on the lingering energy patterns of the Idaho wilderness. He still reviews the 6 hours of static footage occasionally, but he remains unable to find a mechanical or optical flaw in the thermal sensors. The final report is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple technical explanation in the modern era of smart homes. He sleeps with a secondary motion-activated floodlight now because he knows that some observers don't need a point of entry to make their presence felt. Some locations carry a memory that is recorded in the very thermal radiation of the ground and the surrounding atmosphere. The engineering community still discusses the Leland Thorne files as an example of potential sensor degradation in high-altitude, low-temperature environments. However, Leland knows that what his cameras captured was not a hardware failure, but a factual record of a presence that was content to just watch. He spends his time now researching the intersection of historical watch points and the modern digital sensors that are built over the forgotten posts of the past. The cabin stands as a silent witness to the man who was still trying to keep his watch over the valley during the coldest nights of the year. He closes his laptop and turns off the office light with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the watchers in the dark. The final entry in the county file regarding the disappearance of the fire warden noted that he was a man of immense patience and a terrifyingly focused sense of duty. This detail suggests that the presence Leland saw was not an intruder with malicious intent, but an echo of a routine that had been repeated for a lifetime. It suggests that the ridge was acting as a storage medium for the final, motionless hours of a man who refused to leave his post during the storm. Leland believes that the thermal signature was a bridge between the past and the present that allowed a forgotten duty to be seen one last time. The figure on the ridge was merely a reminder that the landscape remembers everyone who has ever stood their ground against the elements. The quiet ridges of northern Idaho rarely make the national news for anything other than routine forest management reports and standard seasonal weather updates. Yet, underneath the surface of the modern security networks, there are stories that remain recorded in the deep, unindexed layers of the local digital archives. Leland Thorne is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive for future study. He continues to document every thermal spike with the same professional objectivity because he knows that the truth is often found in the things that stay still. The reality of the 6-hour watcher is a mystery that requires us to acknowledge the things that we cannot simply explain away with code. The study of the ridge's electromagnetic and thermal resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under restricted access. No further long-duration sightings have been reported by Leland, as the property's grounding system was updated to maintain a more consistent electrical environment. The memory of the figure standing at the tree line remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that frozen and isolated space. Leland has moved on with his career, but he never forgets to check the 10 o'clock logs every single morning when he first logs into his server. He knows that the past is always looking for a way to leave a heat signature on the technology and the lives of the future. The legacy of the fire warden is now a part of the local lore that the forest rangers discuss in their private radio channels during the long winter patrols. They talk about the man who vanished in the storm and the system's architect who found the heat of a ghost on his thermal tablet. For Leland, it isn't a story for a campfire, but a technical record of a night that changed his understanding of what it means to be truly alone. He continues to design his security protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a secure and private environment for his career. The cameras are only the beginning of the observation of a world that we're still learning to measure in the darkness. The final report on the property noted that the outcrop had experienced a localized atmospheric phenomenon known as thermal trapping due to the unique shape of the ridge. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the visual anomalies that Leland had originally sought to quantify with his professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the ridge was acting as a natural mirror for the heat of the earth and the forgotten structures that once stood in the valley below. Leland looks at the tree line and wonders how many other people are being watched by the stories of those who built the frontier. He understands now that the most important data is often the kind that requires 6 hours of patience to even notice. The cabin remains a dark silhouette against the Idaho skyline, while the system's architect continues to search for the patterns in the encrypted data. Leland Thorne keeps his focus on the code, but he's always watching for the shape of a man who doesn't belong to the living world anymore. He knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right moment to be seen by an objective and technical observer. The silence of the mountain is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everything that happened before he arrived. He sleeps soundly now, knowing that the watchman has finally been documented and found his way back into the digital archives of the past. In this new story, they found wet footprints leading to the bed. Then the footprints stopped. The physical layout of a beachfront property is often designed to blur the lines between the natural coastal environment and the comfort of a modern interior. Most residents assume that any evidence of the ocean, such as sand or moisture, is brought in intentionally by those who've spent their day on the shoreline. However, the forensic logs and archived digital images from a high-end vacation home in the Outer Banks of North Carolina suggest that some trails begin without an identifiable point of entry. A routine morning of waking up to the sound of the surf can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when a trail of wet footprints is found leading directly toward a sleeping person's bedside. Leland Vance was a 42-year-old oceanographic engineer who spent his professional hours analyzing tidal patterns and coastal erosion for federal environmental agencies. He'd recently rented a secluded, modern villa perched on a sand dune for the month of November in the year 2024 to finish a critical report on sea level rise. Leland was a man of extreme technical discipline who'd equipped the home with a series of high-resolution motion sensors to protect his expensive monitoring equipment. He relied on real-time data and infrared cameras to maintain a secure perimeter in an area that was often subject to heavy fog and unpredictable weather patterns. He followed a strict nightly routine of securing every sliding glass door and checking the weather stripping before retiring to the primary bedroom for the night. The incident began on a humid Tuesday in the month of November in the year 2024, during a period of intense, low-lying coastal mist. Leland woke up at precisely 5:30 in the morning and noticed a faint, briny scent of sea salt and decaying kelp lingering in his bedroom air. As he stepped out of bed, he felt a sudden, cold dampness beneath his feet and looked down to see a series of large, wet footprints on the hardwood floor. The prints were clearly defined and appeared to be made by bare human feet that were still dripping with seawater and fine, dark sand. He felt a surge of cold adrenaline as he realized the trail began at the bedroom door and ended abruptly, exactly 3 inches from the side of his mattress. He grabbed his professional-grade digital camera to document the impressions before the morning heat could cause the moisture to evaporate from the polished wood. The forensic logs from the camera indicated that the footprints were approximately 12 inches in length and possessed a unique, flattened arch pattern that suggested a heavy, labored gait. Leland immediately reviewed the local server logs for his security system and found that no exterior or interior motion alarms had been triggered during the entire duration of the storm. The high-definition footage from the hallway showed the bedroom door remained closed and undisturbed, and there was no visible movement of any intruder. He checked the sliding glass doors leading to the deck and confirmed they were still locked from the inside with the heavy-duty security bars in place. The next morning, Leland began a step-by-step investigation of the property by reviewing the state records regarding the history of the original land plot before the villa was constructed. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every structural change and utility maintenance that had been performed on the site since it was developed. He discovered that the villa sat on a stretch of beach that had previously been the site of a small, unauthorized fishing camp during the 1930s. According to a county file from 2009, the camp had been wiped out during a sudden and violent hurricane that struck the coast without warning. The archives indicated that one fisherman had reportedly been seen trying to reach the higher ground where the villa's primary bedroom now stood before he was swept away. He searched the digital archives of the local historical society and found a series of recordings from the early development of the Outer Banks regarding the recovery efforts after the Great Storm. These files described a man named Silas Thorne, who was known for his habit of walking the shoreline barefoot even during the coldest winter months of the year. Silas had reportedly been found several days after the storm, his body discovered far inland, but his footprints were said to appear on the dunes for weeks afterward. The witness statements from the original investigation mentioned that the fisherman's cabin had been located at the exact coordinates where Leland's bed was now positioned. Leland realized that the anatomical scale of the wet footprints matched the historical descriptions of the fishermen mentioned in the archived reports. The forensic images from the incident were reviewed by a local digital analyst who found that the water in the footprints contained a high concentration of minerals only found in the deeper offshore trenches. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a physical intruder within the villa, as the fresh sand on the deck showed no footprints or signs of a climb. Records conflict regarding the exact nature of the moisture, with some technicians claiming it was a localized condensation event caused by a failure in the HVAC system during the fog. Leland decided to keep his thermal imaging array active and continued to monitor the floor for any signs of recurring moisture. He kept the original forensic logs on a secure drive as a record of the night that the ocean seemed to reach inside his home. The property remains under constant observation today as Leland continues his oceanographic work with a new focus on the environmental anomalies of coastal structures. He still reviews the high-definition images of the footprints occasionally, but he remains unable to find a mechanical or structural reason for the localized water trail. The final report is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple physical or environmental explanation in the modern age. He sleeps with a secondary motion-activated light now because he knows that some trails don't require an open door to be blazed. Some locations carry a memory that is recorded in the very moisture of the air and the salt that clings to the foundation of the house. The engineering community still discusses the Leland Vance case as an example of potential wicking, where sea spray is pulled through microcracks in the building's envelope. However, Leland knows that what he photographed was not a structural defect, but a factual record of a presence that was seeking the safety of higher ground. He spends his time now researching the intersection of historical shipwrecks and the modern residential developments that are built over the forgotten camps of the past. The villa stands as a silent witness to the fisherman who was still trying to escape the rising tide long after the storm had passed. He closes his laptop and turns off the office light with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the footprints in the dark. The final entry in the county file regarding the disappearance of the fisherman noted that he was a man of immense physical strength and a terrifyingly focused will to survive. This detail suggests that the presence Leland detected was not a malicious entity, but an echo of a desperate struggle that had been repeated for nearly a century. It suggests that the bedroom floor was acting as a storage medium for the final, wet steps of a man who refused to give up his search for dry land. Leland believes that the wet footprints were a bridge between the past and the present that allowed a forgotten tragedy to be seen one last time. The moisture on the floor was merely a reminder that the land we occupy today was once the site of a battle against the elements. The quiet beaches of the Outer Banks rarely make the national news for anything other than routine tourism reports and standard seasonal weather updates for the coast. Yet, underneath the surface of the modern vacation rentals, there are stories that remain recorded in the deep, unindexed layers of the local digital archives. Leland Vance is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive for future study. He continues to document every humidity spike with the same professional objectivity because he knows that the truth is often found in the things that shouldn't be wet. The reality of the disappearing footprints is a mystery that requires us to acknowledge the things that we cannot simply explain away with a structural survey. The study of the property's electromagnetic and moisture resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under restricted access. No further wet trails have been reported by Leland, as the home's ceiling system was updated to include advanced moisture barriers and atmospheric sensors. The memory of the footprints leading to the bed remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that coastal sanctuary. Leland has moved on with his career, but he never forgets to check the floor every single morning when the coastal mist begins to roll in. He knows that the past is always looking for a way to leave a physical signature on the technology and the lives of the future. The legacy of the fisherman is now a part of the local lore that the coastal residents discuss in their private social media groups during the long winter nights. They talk about the man who died in the Great Storm and the engineer who found the salt of a ghost on his polished hardwood floor. For Leland, it isn't a story for a campfire, but a technical record of a night that changed his understanding of what it means to be truly secure. He continues to design his coastal protection protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a stable and private environment. The sensors are only the beginning of the observation of a world that we're still learning to measure in the darkness of the sea. The final report on the property noted that the dune had experienced a localized phenomenon known as capillary rise due to the unique composition of the sand and the foundation. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the moisture anomalies that Leland had originally sought to quantify with his professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a natural conduit for the groundwater and the forgotten history that still sits buried deep beneath the modern flooring. Leland looks at the surf and wonders how many other people are walking on top of the stories of those who were lost to the waves. He understands now that the most important data is often the kind that requires a cold morning and a sharp eye to even begin to notice. The villa remains a dark silhouette against the North Carolina skyline, while the engineer continues to search for the patterns in the tidal data. Leland Vance keeps his focus on the coast, but he's always watching for the shape of a foot that doesn't belong to the living world anymore. He knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right moment to be seen by an objective and technical observer. The silence of the beach is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everything that happened before he arrived. He sleeps soundly now, knowing that the fisherman has finally reached his destination and found his way back into the digital archives of the past. In this new story, a 911 call went silent. Then the operator heard breathing beside her. The psychological pressure of emergency dispatch work often manifests as a heightened sensitivity to the slightest auditory cues within a controlled environment. Most operators assume that the primary source of sound will always originate from the digital line or the mechanical hum of the communication center equipment. However, the dispatch logs and internal acoustic recordings from a high-security facility in rural Pennsylvania suggest that the physical boundaries of a call can become dangerously blurred. A routine shift can quickly transform into a chilling investigation when a dispatcher realizes that the silence on the line is being mirrored by a presence in the room. Vance Sterling was a 54-year-old senior emergency dispatcher who had spent over 25 years managing the graveyard shift for a remote county. He lived in a quiet town on the edge of a massive state forest and took great pride in his ability to remain detached from the chaos of his calls. His primary goal for the year 2024 was to maintain a perfect record of zero missed signals and a sub-10-second response time for all residents. Vance was a man of extreme discipline, who relied on the archive notes and standard operating procedures to navigate the most stressful hours of the night. He worked alone in a reinforced concrete dispatch hub that was specifically designed to be a soundproof and secure environment for critical communications. The incident began on a humid Tuesday in the month of August in the year 2024 during a period of intense atmospheric static. Vance received an incoming emergency signal at precisely 3:19 in the morning from an old farmhouse that had been reportedly abandoned for several years. He answered with his standard professional greeting, but he was met with a heavy and very oppressive silence that lasted for exactly 18 seconds. He checked the digital display and saw that the line was active, but the audio levels from the remote location remained completely flat and unresponsive. He prepared to log the event as a suspected hardware malfunction until he heard a rhythmic and very wet sound originating from his own headset. The sound was the unmistakable pattern of heavy human breathing that did not appear to be coming through the digital communication line from the farmhouse. Vance felt a surge of cold adrenaline as he realized the audio source was manifesting directly beside his own chair in the locked room. He adjusted his headset and turned to look at the empty dispatch floor, but he saw nothing but the glowing monitors and the silent rows of servers. The breathing was synchronized with his own movements, and it seemed to grow louder and more desperate as the timer on the silent call continued to count up. He remained perfectly still and watched as the high-sensitivity microphone on his desk began to register a secondary sound signature in the room. The next morning, Vance began a step-by-step investigation of the facility by reviewing the state records regarding the original construction of the underground hub. He was a meticulous professional who kept detailed records of every electrical surge and equipment calibration that had been performed on the local server. He discovered that the dispatch center was built on the site of a former psychiatric facility that had operated during the 1930s before being demolished. According to the archive notes from a county file from 2009, the original building had a specialized wing for patients with severe respiratory distress. The archives indicated that one patient had reportedly died in the exact location where the dispatch console now sat during a storm. He searched the digital archives of the local historical society and found a series of recordings from the early development of the county's emergency response network. These files described a man named Silas Thorne, who was a night watchman for the original facility and was known for his tireless patrols of the halls. Silas had reportedly disappeared during a massive fire in 1940, and his body was never recovered from the ruins of the basement levels. The witness statements from the original investigation mentioned that the watchman was often heard before he was seen due to a chronic and very heavy breathing. Vance realized that the silent call had originated from a location that used the same phone line designation as the watchman's old station. The audio logs from the incident were reviewed by technicians who found that the breathing was recorded on the internal track but not the external line. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a physical intruder within the locked dispatch hub, and the surveillance cameras showed Vance was entirely alone. Records conflict regarding the exact nature of the atmospheric static that occurred on that night, but some locals claimed it was a recurring temporal anomaly. Vance decided to keep a secondary recording device on his desk and continued to monitor the signal for any signs of the watchman's return. He kept the original dispatch logs on a secure drive as a record of the night that the boundaries of his job failed. The dispatch hub remains operational today as Vance continues his work with a new focus on the acoustic history of the properties he monitors. He still reviews the 18 seconds of silence occasionally, but he remains unable to find a mechanical flaw in the communication software or the headset. The final recording is preserved in a secure archive as a testament to an event that defies a simple technical or environmental explanation. He works with the office door open now because he knows that some presences do not need a key to enter the room. Some locations carry a memory that is broadcasted through the very wires and frequencies that we use to connect with the living. The engineering community still discusses the Vance Sterling logs as an example of potential crosstalk or signal bleeding in high-sensitivity communication arrays. However, Vance knows that what he heard was not a digital error but a factual record of a man who was still trying to report for duty. He spends his time now researching the intersection of historical tragedies and the modern infrastructure that is built on top of those sites. The dispatch center stands as a silent witness to the watchman who never truly finished his final rounds in the dark. He closes his logbook and turns off the console with a sense of total and complete investigative clarity about the sounds of the night. The final report on the incident noted that the facility had experienced a localized vacuum effect due to the intense storm and the underground ventilation. This discovery provided a potential scientific basis for the auditory anomalies that Vance had originally sought to quantify with his professional-grade sensors. It suggests that the room was acting as a resonance chamber for the sounds of the surrounding earth and the forgotten structures below. Vance believes that the silent call was a bridge between the past and the present that allowed the watchman to be heard one last time. The breathing beside him was merely a reminder that the job of protecting others is a responsibility that never truly ends for some. The quiet hills of Pennsylvania rarely make the national news for anything other than routine weather events and standard agricultural reports for the region. Yet underneath the surface of the modern communication networks, there are stories that remain recorded in the dark corners of the local digital archives. Vance Sterling is one of the few who has a factual record of the recurring impossible hidden on a secure and encrypted drive. He continues to answer every call with the same professional calm because he knows that anyone might be listening from the other side. The truth is often more unsettling than a simple mistake because it requires us to acknowledge the things we cannot see. The study of the dispatch hub's acoustic resonance was completed in the spring of 2025, and the results were filed under a restricted access. No further silent calls have been reported by the other operators as the facility's grounding system was updated to prevent further atmospheric static events. The memory of the breathing in the headset remains the only proof that something consistent and deliberate occurred in that locked and secure room. Vance has moved on with his career, but he never forgets to check the signal levels every single time the clock strikes 3:19. He knows that the past is always looking for a way to communicate through the technology that we use to keep the world safe. The legacy of the night watchman is now a part of the local lore that the dispatchers discuss in their private messages during the long graveyard shifts. They talk about the man who died in the fire and the senior operator who heard the heat of a ghost in the cold. For Vance, it isn't a story for entertainment, but a technical record of a night that changed his understanding of the limits of his profession. He continues to design his response protocols with a new perspective on the true meaning of a secure and reliable connection. The lines are only the beginning of the communication with a world that we are still learning to understand in the silence. The final entry in the county file regarding the farmhouse call noted that no working phone lines had been connected to the property for 20 years. This detail confirms that the signal Vance received was physically impossible according to the current standards of the local telecommunications infrastructure and maintenance. Yet the digital signature remains on the server as a factual piece of evidence that a call was placed and held for 18 seconds. Vance looks at the empty farmhouse on his way home and wonders how many other voices are waiting for someone to answer their signal. He understands now that the most important calls are often the ones where nothing is said at all during the wait. The house on the hill remains a dark silhouette against the state forest, while the dispatch hub continues to hum with the activity of the night. Vance Sterling keeps his focus on the monitors, but he is always listening for the sound of a rhythm that doesn't belong to the living. He knows that the archives are full of messages that are waiting for the right frequency to be heard by a patient ear. The silence on the line is no longer a void, but a space that is filled with the history of everyone who lived there. He sleeps soundly in the morning, knowing that the watchman is no longer standing alone in the ruins of the past.